Good morning, everyone, and thank you, operator. This is Chairman Heath Tarbert, and this meeting will come to order. This is a public meeting of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The meeting will be held via conference call in accordance with the agency's implementation of social distancing due to the COVID-19 or coronavirus pandemic. I'd like to welcome members of the public and market participants who are on the phone or streaming this meeting through our website. I'd also like to welcome my fellow commissioners who are also participating via conference call. Commissioner Quintens, Commissioner Benham, Commissioner Stump, and Commissioner Berkovitz. We assembled today to consider 5 matters on which we'll be voting. First, a proposed rule on electronic trading risk principles. Second, a vote on the withdrawal of previously issued proposed rule and supplemental proposal for Regulation AT. Third, a final rule on post-trade name give-up on swap execution facilities. Fourth, a final rule on alternative compliance with anti-evasionary measures of the inter-affiliate swap clearing exemption. And then finally, a proposed rule to extend Phase 6 compliance, the Phase 6 compliance date for initial margin requirements for uncleared swaps in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then finally, I'll make an announcement regarding our vote via seriatim yesterday on the Volcker Rules Covered Funds final rule before we close the meeting. At the outset, I'd ask for the cooperation of those who are speaking during the meeting today in observing a few good practices for the benefit of our listeners, and of course for those who may listen at some point in the future to this recording. First, when you're about to speak, please ensure your phone line is unmuted. Second, as you begin speaking, please identify yourself. And finally, when you're not speaking, please keep your phone line muted. As is now a CFTC tradition, we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I know these are trying times, but I hope reciting the pledge will help us affirm our commitment to liberty and justice for all. I again want to thank Commissioner Berkovitz for his reflections on the pledge during our last open meeting. And as I said in the beginning of my tenure, one thing I like about the pledge is that it essentially affirms that all of us is in this together. It's the only pledge I know of that starts with I and ends with all. So if I could ask all commissioners, as well as any other members of the staff who'd like to participate, to go ahead and unmute your lines now so we can say the pledge together, and I will begin it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We're now going to go ahead and move to opening statements for anyone that has them in order of seniority. Commissioners are free to reserve their time to make a longer closing statement if they wish. Since we've got a lot to cover today, I'm just going to reserve the bulk of my remarks for the individual matters to be addressed and possibly for the end. I just want to thank everyone for, again, holding this open meeting, for all of the work that the staff has done since our last open meeting, and also the commissioners and all the commissioners' offices. This is a tremendous amount of work to be voting on these items today. So with that, I am pleased to move on to Commissioner Quintens for any opening statement he'd like to make.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. This is Commissioner Quintens. I, like you, I think will forgo making an opening statement and probably use some of that time possibly in the discussion of the individual rules. Thank you again to you and your staff in the agency for the open meeting this morning.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Benham.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to my fellow commissioners, staff, and everyone who's had a chance to, or has a chance to join us this morning. I will also forego my opening statement and share some of my views and questions throughout the morning as we discuss these few rules. But I do want to, send a welcome, of course, to everyone who's listening this morning, and I hope everyone's doing well and staying safe in these trying times. And again, Mr. Chairman, thanks for bringing up these rules, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, am going to reserve my comments for later in the morning as we discuss the specific rules. I am pleased to be here today, and I hope that everyone is doing well. As Commissioner Benham said, I hope everyone's staying safe in these trying times. And I wanted to thank the staff who worked on these rules before us today. They involve 3 different divisions, and many, many people worked on these rules over the course of months and years, and a lot of work went into this even in the last few days. So I wanted to thank them and recognize them. But I will reserve the rest of my comments for the specifics later.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will simply echo pretty much everything that's been said so far, welcoming everybody to this meeting and thanking my colleagues on the Commission, thanking you, Mr. Chairman, and thanking my staff, thanking the Commission staff. There's, as I've said before, a 5-0 vote oftentimes can mean a lot more work than a split vote, and we'll have that reflects a lot of the work that's gone into some of these that we'll be voting on today. I just want to express appreciation for everybody that's worked hard to get where we are today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Berkovitz. Well, for each of the items on today's agenda, staff will make presentations to the Commission. After each staff presentation, the floor will be open for questions and comments from each commissioner. Following the close of discussion, the Commission will vote on the recommendation. All final votes conducted in the public meeting will be recorded votes. The results of votes approving issuance of rulemaking documents will be included with those documents in the Federal Register. To facilitate preparation of approved documents for publication in the Federal Register, I'd now ask the Commission to grant unanimous consent for staff to make the necessary technical corrections prior to submitting them to the Federal Register.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you very much. Without objection, so ordered. Well, at this time, I would like to invite a combined staff presentation that will focus primarily on the proposed rule on electronic trading principles. The staff will also briefly note the separate proposal that we'll be voting on regarding the withdrawal of the previously issued proposed rule and supplemental proposal for Regulation AT. From the Division of Market Oversight on the phone are Dorothy DeWitt, our Director, Marilee Dahlman, Special Counsel, and Joseph Ochin, Attorney Advisor. I will now hand it over to the DMO team to go ahead and present.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Commissioners. Thank you all for the opportunity to present today. My name is Dorothy DeWitt, and I'm the Director of the Division of Market Oversight, or DMO. Today, we present for consideration by the Commission a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, entitled Risk Principles, or Electronic Trading Risk Principles. We will refer to that NPRM as Risk Principles today. These risk principles reflect the CFTC's mission to promote the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of the U.S. derivatives market through sound, principles-based regulation. These risk principles build on prior work by the Commission, Commission staff, industry, and other market participants to ensure market integrity. In addition, they reflect numerous conversations between, the prior work was by the Commission staff, and industry to ensure market integrity. And in addition, they reflect numerous conversations between staff, the Commission staff, and exchanges and a variety of market participants regarding how best to address the risk principles posed by electronic trading. These risk principles are designed to ensure that moving forward, designated contract markets, or DCMs, continue to as technology and the markets evolve. We look forward to industry comment and feedback during the comment period for this proposal. I would like to thank the DMO team who led this project, Marilee Dahlman and Joe Ochin. The risk principles team also included our DMO colleagues, Jeanette Curtis, David Steinberg, and Rachel Berdansky, as well as our colleagues from multiple areas of the CFTC. They include our colleagues from the Office of the Chief Economist, or OCE, Asan Anur, and Elena Guskonis, Carlin Metzger, and the Division of Enforcement, or DOE, Greg Scopino. Apologies, Greg Scopino is with the Division of Swap Dealer and Intermediate Oversight. Jeff Burns is from the Office of the General Counsel. We would like to thank them for their tireless work and willingness to pitch in any way helpful. We also thank the chairman, each of the commissioners, and their staffs for their constructive comments as we prepared this proposal. Those comments serve to improve the final product that we present today. I will now turn it over to Marilee Dahlman, who will discuss the purpose and background of the risk principles.
Thank you, Dorothy. And thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, for the opportunity to present. This NPRM proposes a set of principles for DCM to address the prevention, detection, and mitigation of market disruptions and system anomalies associated with the entry of electronic orders and messages into DCM's electronic trading platforms. Such disruptions or anomalies may negatively impact the proper functioning of the trading platforms and the ability of other market participants to trade and manage their own risk. These disruptions and anomalies can arise from excessive messaging caused by malfunctioning systems, fat finger orders, or erroneous messages manually entered that result in unintentionally large or off-price orders, and the loss of connection between an order management system and the trading platform. DCMs have an interest in the effective prevention, detection, and mitigation of market disruptions and system anomalies associated with electronic trading activities. DCMs are addressing most, if not all, of the electronic trading risks currently presented to their trading platforms. DCMs have implemented pre-trade risk controls, including messaging throttles, order size maximums, and heartbeat messages confirming connectivity. DCMs also conduct due diligence and testing before participants can use certain connectivity methods. DCMs have developed risk mitigation measures in response to actual or potential disruptions to their markets, as well as in response to existing rules, such as those promulgated pursuant to DCM Core Principle 4 and codified in Part 38 of the Commission's regulations. Because DCMs have developed processes for identifying and managing risks, the risk principles may not require DCMs to adopt additional controls or rules. However, the proposed risk principles will help ensure that DCMs continue to monitor risks as they evolve along with the markets and make reasonable modifications as appropriate. The risk principles reflect a flexible framework under which DCMs can adapt to evolving technology and markets. There are 3 risk principles. The first risk principle, proposed 38251E, requires each DCM to adopt rules governing participants subject to its jurisdiction to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. The second risk principle, proposed 38251F, requires DCMs to implement adequate risk controls designed to address the potential threat of market disruptions and system anomalies associated with electronic trading. The third risk principle, 38251G, requires DCMs to notify CFTC staff in the event of a market disruption. The risk principles supplement existing Commission regulations governing DCMs by directly addressing certain requirements in DCM Core Principle 4 and its implementing regulations. First, the risk principles provide for prospective action by DCMs to take steps to prevent market disruptions and system anomalies, building on existing requirements to conduct real-time monitoring and resolve conditions that are disruptive to the market. Second, the risk principles explicitly focus on disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. While existing Commission regulations focus on market disruptions more generally caused by sudden price movements, market disruptions or system anomalies also can be the result of excessive messaging or the loss of connection between an order management system and the trading platform. Such events could impact the systems accepting messages or matching trades at the DCM. These events can impact market participants and the integrity of the market as a whole. In recent years, electronic trading has become increasingly prevalent on DCMs. At the same time, DCM electronic trading platforms have been faced with actual and potential disruptions. Such instances highlight the risks that DCMs face from the interaction of their own systems with those of market participants. The risk principles attempt to balance the need for flexibility in a rapidly changing technological landscape with the need for a clear regulatory requirement that DCMs establish rules governing electronic orders, as well as on market participants themselves, to prevent and mitigate market disruptions and system anomalies associated with electronic trading activities. Importantly, the risk principles would not create any form of strict liability for the DCMs in the event that such disruptions or anomalies occur, notwithstanding such rules or controls. The risk principles also do not require any specifically defined set of rules or risk controls. As provided in the proposed acceptable practices for implementing the risk principles, DCMs will satisfy the risk principles if they have rules and pre-trade risk controls that are reasonably designed to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. Reasonably designed means that a DCM's rules and risk controls are objectively reasonable. Several existing regulations in Part 38 generally govern the DCM's role in monitoring for and mitigating the effects of market disruptions and system anomalies. These include Regulations 38157 and 38251C, requiring a DCM to conduct real-time monitoring, Regulation 38255, requiring a DCM to implement risk control mechanisms, and Regulation 38607, requiring a DCM that permits direct electronic access to have systems and controls reasonably designed to facilitate an FCM's management of financial risk. Industry itself has also taken steps to address the risk of market disruption. For example, in October 2019, the Futures Industry Association presented to the CFTC's Technology Advisory Committee certain best practices for exchange risk controls. As Joe will discuss, FIA has conducted numerous surveys which found a substantial increase in the implementation of market integrity controls since 2010. At that same TAC meeting, ICE reported that its controls were consistent with the FIA's findings. At a TAC meeting the previous year, CME had reported that its risk controls were consistent with recent recommendations made by IOSCO. While the proposed risk principles apply to DCMs, all participants in commission-regulated markets have a responsibility to take steps to prevent market disruptions. We note that, as to FCMs, for example, the National Futures Association is in the early stages of updating its guidance to members in this area. And now I'll turn it over to Joe Oatzen, who will describe the risk principles in more detail.
Thank you, Marilee, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I will now discuss the 3 risk principles set forth in proposed Commission regulations 38.251E, F, and G, as well as proposed acceptable practices for risk principles 1 and 2, to be added to Appendix B to Part 38 of the Commission's regulations. First, proposed Regulation 38.251E, Risk Principle 1, provides that a DCM must adopt and implement rules governing market participants subject to its jurisdiction to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. Staff believes that various DCM practices in place today are consistent with Risk Principle 1, such as exchange-provided risk controls, primarily addressing financial risk or market risk, that also address preventing or mitigating market disruptions caused by electronic trading. For example, FIA has indicated that since 2010, it has conducted various surveys of exchanges, as well as a sampling of its members. These surveys reflect clearing firms' broad use of message and execution throttles, price collars, maximum order sizes, order, trade, and position drop copy, and order cancellation capability. FIA's October 2019 TAC presentation noted that initiatives are underway at most exchanges to develop application programming interface, or API access, to various risk controls, and to improve the functionality available in exchange certification and conformance testing environments. Staff believes that current industry practices serve as examples of measures that all DCMs could adopt as rules, as appropriate, to address the potential for electronic trading activities to cause market disruptions or system anomalies. Risk Principle 1 will help ensure that DCMs continue to monitor these risks as they evolve along with the market and make reasonable changes as appropriate to address those evolving risks. Staff acknowledges that it may not be possible for a DCM to prevent all market disruptions and system anomalies. A DCM would not necessarily have violated this principle if a market disruption or system anomaly does occur, despite its having rules in place. To that end, staff is proposing acceptable practices, providing that a DCM can comply with Risk Principle 1 by adopting rules reasonably designed to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. These acceptable practices provide DCMs with discretion to determine what rules to impose on market participants to address electronic trading risks subject to Commission action. The acceptable practices are intended to provide DCMs with reasonable discretion to impose rules to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions. Consistent with existing DCM practices, this could include requiring market participants to implement exchange-provided risk controls and order cancellation functionality, and requiring testing in advance of exchange access. In developing a framework to address these risks, DCMs should take into account industry best practices and what risk controls and testing practices are technologically feasible. Turning now to Risk Principle 2, proposed Regulation 38.251F provides that a DCM must subject all electronic orders to exchange-based pre-trade risk controls to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. Staff believes that the existing acceptable practices for DCM Core Principle 4 list appropriate DCM implemented risk controls, including pre-trade limits on order size, price collars or bands around the current price, message throttles, and daily price limits. The existing acceptable practices further provide that the DCM must set the parameters for these controls, so long as the controls and their parameters are reasonably likely to prevent market disruptions and price distortions. Risk Principle 2 does not change existing acceptable practices for Commission Regulation 38.255, which remain in effect. The purpose of Risk Principle 2 is to require DCMs to consider market participants' trading activity when designing and implementing exchange-based risk controls to address market disruptive events. Existing guidance provides that such controls must be adapted to the unique characteristics of the markets to which they apply and must be designed to avoid market disruptions without unduly interfering with that market's price discovery function. In contrast, proposed Risk Principle 2 more explicitly requires DCMs to consider risk controls that address market disruptions associated with electronic trading. This principle provides flexibility for technological progress. For example, while a control called message throttle may be appropriate now, industry measures to address excessive messaging could change in the future. It also allows DMO to assess compliant risk controls as part of its rule enforcement review program, comparing all DCMs to a baseline of controls on electronic trading and order entry that are prevalent and effective across all DCMs. FIA's October 2019 TAC presentation illustrates measures that DCMs could consider adopting to address risks posed by electronic trading. The presentation listed specific pre-trade risk controls that are critical in preventing market disruptions, including fat finger or maximum size, market data reasonability checks, repeatable execution limits, and messaging limits and throttles. Given the prevalence of existing exchange-based risk controls, staff expects that many DCM practices are consistent with Risk Principle 2. Depending on the circumstances, it may be possible for a DCM to appropriately conclude that its existing pre-trade risk controls satisfy the acceptable practices for Risk Principle 2. Turning to Risk Principle 3, proposed regulation 38.251G provides that a DCM must promptly notify staff of any significant disruptions to its electronic trading platforms and provide timely information on the causes and remediation. Risk Principle 3 includes a significant threshold for notification. An internal disruption in a market participant's own trading system should not be considered significant unless it causes a market disruption materially affecting the DCM's platform and other market participants. A significant disruption is a situation where the ability of other market participants to execute trades, engage in price discovery, or manage their risks is materially impacted by a malfunction of a market participant's trading system. Risk Principle 3 would obligate the DCM to notify commission staff of the event promptly after the DCM becomes aware of it. Risk Principle 3 is to be distinguished from existing Commission Regulation 38.1051E, which requires DCMs to notify the Commission in the event of significant system malfunctions. Risk Principle 3 addresses market disruptive events, as opposed to incidents that impact the integrity of a DCM's internal technological systems. Staff believes that Risk Principle 3's notification requirement will assist the Commission's oversight and its ability to monitor and assess market disruptions across all DCMs. Staff expects that notification under Risk Principle 3 would take a similar form to the current notification process for electronic trading halts, cybersecurity incidents, or activation of a DCM business continuity disaster recovery plan under existing 38.1051E. At this time, I will turn it back to Dorothy to discuss staff's recommendation that the Commission withdraw Regulation 18.
Thank you, Joe. Given, among other things, the significant time that has elapsed since Reg AT was proposed, the complexity of the issues, and the inconsistency of the comments, as well as the vast majority of which were negative, we do not consider it practicable to go final with those proposed rules at this time or in the foreseeable future. This is especially true given that technology, market structure, risk, and industry standards have evolved so significantly in the past 4 or 5 years in this fast developing area. Staff believes that withdrawal of the rule, which is now stale, is appropriate. That concludes the staff's presentation on the risk principles notice of proposed rulemaking and the withdrawal of regulation automated trading. We're happy to answer your questions.
This is Chairman Heath Tarbert again. I want to sincerely thank you, Dorothy, Marilee, and Joe for an outstanding presentation. And to begin the Commission's discussion and consideration of these matters, I'll first entertain a motion to approve the notice of proposed rulemaking on electronic trading principles.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you very much. Now I'll entertain a motion to approve the issuance of the notice withdrawing the December 17th, 2015 notice of proposed rulemaking and the November 25th, 2016 supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking on regulation automated trading.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. I'd now like to open the floor for 2 rounds of Commissioner questions and statements in order of seniority. And the thought here is that obviously we'll want to ask questions of our staff, but by having a second round, we can also facilitate some discussion among commissioners, because I know this is an important area that a lot of people have a number of different views on. So I will begin, but before I get into the substance of my questions and comments, I want to extend my thanks to so many people that made today possible. First of all, DMO staff, Marilee Dahlman, of course, Joe, but also David Steinberg, Rachel Bernansky, Jeanette Curtis, and then, of course, Dorothy, who leads the division. And I want to thank them not only for their work in the past few months on this, but also the tireless work over the past several years, almost 7 years, in fact, from the concept release to Reg AT to today. They've worked with all stakeholders to develop a real understanding of electronic markets and how best to address the novel issues raised by the evolution to what we see today in these markets. This team has been instrumental in the agency's own evolution as we address this fundamental shift in our markets. But it's not just DMO. This was really a whole of CFTC effort. So therefore, I'd like to thank in our Office of Chief Economist, in particular, Essen Owner, Eleni Uskonis, as well as Jeff Burns and Carlene Kim in the Office of General Counsel. But it doesn't stop there. Carlton Metzger of the Enforcement Division and Greg Scapino of DSIO also had input into this proposal. So this proposal and all the development that went into it, again, as I stress, was a cross-functional team effort that has raised the understanding of electronic markets across our agency. So I think as far as the presentation itself went, Dorothy, Marilee, and Joe, I think you did a fabulous job outlining it. I think it's very clear from your presentation that this proposal provides a reasonable discretion and flexibility to providing to exchanges. And so my question is really, what tools are available to the Commission to determine whether an exchange's rules and free trade risk controls are in fact reasonably designed to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. This is Marilee. There are several tools. So with respect to an application for designation as a contract market, if the Commission finds that the applicant's rules are not reasonably designed to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading, or that pre-trade risk controls were not reasonably designed. The entity would not be in compliance with core principles, specifically core principle 4, and the commission would not issue an order of designation. Another tool is that if a DCM certifies rules or pre-trade risk controls as being in compliance with the Act or Commission regulations, the Commission can object or deny certification, or could stay the certification for 90 days to conduct a review on the grounds that the proposed rule or rule amendment is potentially inconsistent with the CEA or Commission regulations. Another tool is that a DCM could request that the Commission approve a new rule or rule amendment under 40.5. And under that regulation, the Commission only approves a new rule or rule amendment if it's not inconsistent with the CEA or Commission regulations. So a DCM rule adopted to comply with the proposed 38251 regulations that is not reasonable would not be, it would be inconsistent with the Commission regulations. Finally, sorry. I was just going to add one more thing. A DMO rule enforcement review could also find an exchange rule or risk control is not reasonable. And in that case, the examination would issue a deficiency finding that the exchange was not in compliance with the rule, and the deficiency would then be referred to DOE. And then if DOE takes action, the Commission would have to approve that.
Terrific. Well, good. Well, that really, I think, rounds out the idea that, you know, we're providing a lot of reasonable discretion here, but it's not completely open-ended, and that's an important point to note. I don't have any further questions. I thought I would just spend a few minutes. This is Chairman Tarbert. Maybe just putting all of this in a larger context and why we're pushing this forward today. If there's members of the public sort of tuning in, what this is all about, the big picture. As Dorothy mentioned, you know, the mission of the CFTC is to promote the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of U.S. derivatives markets through sound regulation. Now, we can't achieve that mission if we rest on our laurels, particularly given the ever-evolving technology that makes our derivatives markets, the U.S. derivatives markets, the envy of the world. What sound regulation is today may not be what sound regulation is tomorrow. And I was reminded of a novel that I read a few years back called The Leopard. It later was made into a movie with Burt Lancaster about 19th century Italy. But there was a paradoxical observation that really lies at the heart of both the novel and the movie itself. And the famous quote is as follows: "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." So the novel, The Leopard, focuses on the role of the aristocracy amid the social turbulence of 19th century Italy. But its central thesis that achieving stability in changing times itself requires change, I think, can be applied equally to the regulation of rapidly changing financial markets. And so why is this proposal before us today? Well, it's before us today because 20, 30 years ago, a floor trader, if they came back and were magically transported into the 21st century, would scarcely recognize a futures exchange. The screaming and the shouting of buy and sell orders, reminiscent of the film Trading Places that we've all seen, has largely been replaced with silence, or at best, let's say, the monotonous humming of large data centers. So since the last 2 or 3 decades, 96% of our trading now occurs on electronic systems. The important point to note at the outset is that I think this shift to electronic trading has greatly benefited market participants. And we have a number of academic studies that essentially provide evidence, if not prove that fact. Spreads have narrowed, liquidity has improved, and transaction costs have dropped. But I think there's something even far more practical when I think about it that demonstrates to me that this was the right move. and that's the last few months. With social distancing due to coronavirus lockdowns, places like the New York Stock Exchange, which still had some floor trading, had to shut down. But our futures markets remained open and were able to have their highest, effectively, sort of trading volumes ever because people needed them the most to hedge their risk. And if we had not had electronic trading, we may very well have had to close down our futures markets. And so that's a really important point. But the bottom line, of course, is, look, electronic trading is here. And this is something that the CFTC has recognized now for at least a decade. And electronic trading, though, while I mentioned all of its attributes, all of its reasons why I think it is ultimately superior, there are also potential risks that weren't around in 30 years ago that are, in fact, unique to electronics trading systems. And these can be human errors, like fat fingers, but they can also be errors that derive from automated or algorithmic trading, like order matching engines and messaging and all those sorts of things. And so the Commission is not recognizing that for the first time today, of course. It's thought about this for quite some time. 7 years ago, a different set of commissioners issued a concept release asking the public for changes to be made to our regulations in light of electronic trading. Ultimately, they later proposed Reg AT and a supplement to Reg AT. And I think, look, I'm not sure if there's any commissioner sitting on the commission today that would vote for Reg AT as is. Everybody recognizes to some degree that it's not perfect, and I think the DMO staff sort of outlined that well. But I do think that Reg AT drove a very helpful discussion about the risk that should be considered and what the Commission should start thinking about in terms of a response. From my point of view, Reg AT, I think that the biggest issue there is that ultimately it was pretty prescriptive, and it would have frozen in time a set of controls that levels of market operators and market participants would have required to place on trading. And since that time, we've even seen tremendous more changes, improvements in technology and computing power. Moore's Law, for those of you that are familiar with it, alone would predict that computing power would have increased tenfold during that time period. So I want to commend everyone on the CFTC and all of our former commissioners on focusing on these risks in the last decade. But times change, and Reg AT would not have changed with them. And so the CFTC, I think, has to think about that carefully. And rather than swim against the tide and say no electronic trading, the only real course of action is to have our regulatory framework evolve with it. And so how does a regulator change with the times while still fulfilling our statutory role in overseeing the derivatives markets? Well, my view in a case like this is the use of principles-based regulation. And I'll talk about that a little later, but again, my view is that principles-based regulation is not light touch. It's not toothless. It is very important, but at the same time, it will allow the flexibility we need, both our exchanges as well as the CFTC, to evolve as the risks themselves evolve. And so I think today, the way I see this proposal is that not only will it address the potential concerns arising from electronic trading, but my hope is that it may also serve as a framework for how we think about other areas where there's attributes that lead us to a more principles-based approach as opposed to a more prescriptive-based approach, when things are constantly rapidly changing and we need to change with it. So in sum, I think this proposal that you all have worked on, that I've worked on closely with my fellow commissioners, as we go back to that novel that I mentioned, The Leopard, recognizes that things will have to change if effectively we want things to stay as they are. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and hand it over to Commissioner Quintens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Quintens. I think I will focus the comments in this round on the withdrawal of Reg AT and maybe address some specifics in the proposal in the second round. I think about the conversation that Reg AT provoked possibly a little differently. At the least, I think it was a very high stakes conversation around exactly the things that the chairman mentioned, which were, in my view, a prescriptive approach that I don't think adequately recognized the incentive structures in the market to continually address these risks and evolve that response. And let me first say that I would like to acknowledge how much time and effort and thinking by the staff goes into the development and writing and the putting forward of proposals, regardless of the criticism that those proposals may generate or the opposition they may provoke. And so I just would always like to recognize how hard people work in putting things before us to consider. But I do have to acknowledge that I feel as though I've been fairly outspoken in my criticism of Reg AT and the policy proposals in it. I feel like it is long overdue for the Commission to withdraw both the initial proposal and the supplemental proposal because they would have required certain types of market participants based purely on their trading functionality, on their strategies or their market access methods to register for the first time with the Commission, notwithstanding that they did not act as intermediaries in the markets or even hold customer funds. Moreover, the NPRMs proposed, in my view, extremely prescriptive requirements for the types of risk controls that exchanges and FCMs and trading firms would be required to implement. And I would like to acknowledge that the motion before us to withdraw these NPRMs specifically reject those policy responses to the perceived risks of electronic trading, which I believe is appropriate. And lastly, by withdrawing these NPRMs, the market and the public, I believe, can finally consider as dead the prior Commission's significant and, in my view, likely unconstitutional overreach on accessing firms' proprietary source code and protected intellectual property without a subpoena. As I've said before, the Reg AT NPRMs were poorly crafted and flawed public policy that failed to understand the true risks of the electronic trading environment and the intrinsic incentives that exchanges and market participants have to mitigate and address those risks, which come down to them being going concerns and their own solvency. So I'm pleased the Commission is officially rejecting the policy rationales and the regulatory requirements proposed in the Regulation AT NPRMs and is instead embracing the principles approach before us today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll conclude my first round of comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Benham.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of questions for the team, and I do want to just take a moment to thank Dorothy DeWitt and everyone in DMO, specifically Mary Lee and Joe, for their presentations today. They were excellent. And Mr. Chairman, you did a great job in listing all the other individuals, Commission staff, past and present, and I do want to echo the individuals that you named and listed because everyone deserves credit for the work that went into both the risk principles proposal before us today and both the Reg AT original NPRM and supplemental. Before I get into my questions, though, I do want to address some matter, and I'll do this in part, I think, in my second round as well, the Reg AT withdrawal. You know, in my view, it's pretty unconventional and unusual that a current commission would withdraw a former proposal that was voted on in a bipartisan fashion. And I will say that, you know, if you look back at the vote, it was the bipartisan vote that was made at the time was by our former chairman, Chris Giancarlo. And if you read his statement, he he was quite critical of Reg AT. He was quite critical of Reg AT when he became chairman a few years later. And I think it's important to sort of think about what that product reflected at the time and how it evolved, and the fact that the commission, going from the original NPRM to the supplemental, was willing to adjust and adapt to both criticism and critiques from the marketplace, but also an evolving market structure. And Mr. Chairman, you pointed this out very elegantly, that we do need to adapt. The derivatives markets have always been the most innovative, the most technologically advanced, and the markets that I think attract the greatest minds in terms of thinking about risk management and price discovery. And although, and I will confirm this openly, and I've said this in the past as well, Reg AT, the original proposal, and the supplemental were far from perfect. There was a lot of policy ideas that were introduced as a result of market events that had occurred, going back to the 2010 flash crash and a number of events in the Treasury market and night capital and whatnot. So this was a response, a policy response, as many of the things we do and the actions we take as policymakers are. Although markets have, from a sort of incident standpoint, remained relatively stable, and I knock on wood while I'm saying this, despite going through very turbulent market events, including the COVID pandemic in March and April, it's, I think, hard to suggest that we're not going to continue to have such volatility and potentially technological errors or issues that may arise in the future. And point being here is that I have an issue with withdrawing the proposal, especially one that was voted on in a bipartisan fashion, as opposed to taking a fresh look at what was introduced, learning from the comments, and potentially amending what was originally laid out as a policy framework for the Commission to consider, obviously in conjunction with market participants and the public, as we all seek, I think, and I am pretty confident in this, a shared goal in transparent, fair, and orderly market. So I will be opposing the withdrawal, and not certainly because I think Reg AT was perfect, as I said before, but because I think it sets a dangerous precedent for the Commission, and one that really does not reflect well on what we do in a collegial way as a Commission, and that we've done historically. And I hope going forward that we look at these documents as precedent and as a mark of the past of how we need to be better at our jobs and improve on the work we've done, not just wholeheartedly pushing them aside as an error and then something that was a mistake, full stop. So with that, I'm going to pivot, and if Dorothy and team could just take a few minutes to answer my questions in this first round, I would appreciate it. And again, thanks to all of you for your time and your commitment to this. It's extremely helpful, and I am grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing up this issue. It certainly would be easy not to, but I recognize the points you made, that we have to remain fluid in our policy, and we have to move with the markets. And if the technology advances so quickly, we need to be moving with it to the extent that we can. So first question for the team, just curious from a current DCM practice, current DMO rules, do the current DCM practices as we generally know them sort of meet the proposed principles? And Marilee, I think you sort of suggested this, so I don't want to waste time or be redundant, but from my reading of the proposal, it seems like a lot of the principles are not going to necessarily require new action out of the DCMs, because many of the principles that we're going to be voting on later are either being met or sort of ingrained in the rule books of the DCMs.
Thank you, Commissioner Benham. This is Dorothy. Normally, we present these rules with our team sitting together at the table and can easily turn to one another. So for the purposes of all the Q&As, we've asked Marilee if she'll act as the central person who can take the question and then ask the appropriate person within our team to answer it. And that will allow us to ensure that we have smooth answers to your questions. So I'll turn it over to you, Marilee, to conduct to oversee the Q&A. Thank you.
Sure, that sounds good, Dorothy. So thank you very much for that question, Commissioner. I'll turn it over to Joe, who can respond to that.
Thanks, Marilee. This is Joe Ochen. So we do think it's possible that DCMs may determine upon review of the risk principles that they do not need to update their current rules or controls at this time. We believe that DCMs are addressing the electronic trading risks currently presented to their trading platforms. DCMs have developed pre-trade risk controls, including message throttles, order size maximums, and heartbeat messages that confirm connectivity. DCMs also conduct due diligence and testing before participants can utilize connectivity methods. However, a formal analysis of DCM compliance with the risk principles would have to be done through the rule enforcement review process. We note that pursuant to the proposed acceptable practices, DCMs have reasonable discretion in terms of what rules and controls are sufficient. So they will have flexibility and discretion to determine appropriate rules and controls for their markets.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that. I want to turn to the acceptable practices that are in the NPRM, and I'm trying to get I think it would be good for the public to get a better sense on the division's intent behind acceptable practices, and legally, and let's just use the reasonably designed risk principle, sort of in the DCM's requirement to sort of implement rules and risk controls that are, quote, reasonably designed to meet the risk principles. What was the conversation, or what was the sort of legal analysis to put the reasonably designed in acceptable practices as opposed to the text of the rule? And are there any, I guess, legal ramifications from having some of the statements put into the acceptable practices bucket as opposed to the text of the rule itself?
Thank you, Commissioner, for that question. So the legal significance is that DCMs will satisfy their requirements under the risk principles if they've established and implemented rules and controls that are reasonably designed to prevent and detect and mitigate disruptions associated with electronic trading. So as we noted during the presentation, reasonably designed means that the rules and controls need to be objectively reasonable. And so rules and controls that are not reasonably designed would not satisfy the acceptable practices and therefore may be subject to commission action. And we expect that the commission would monitor DCMs to ensure compliance with the risk principles. One thing to note also is that the risk principles don't create a strict liability for the DCMs if disruptions do occur, notwithstanding reasonable controls and rules. So this is an area where DCMs have the best understanding of the risks presented and have full control over how their own systems operate. And we do believe that DCMs have the incentive and the ability to address risk and should have reasonable discretion to do that. And then, I guess, getting at the heart of your question as to why the reasonableness standard is located in the appendix as opposed to the rule text, there's really not a difference in terms of how it operates with respect to the placement of that language. We're striving for a flexible and a clear approach in this rulemaking. And we believe that the relatively brief rule text combined with some further detail in the acceptable practices serves that goal.
Thanks, Mary Lee. Can we do a quick follow-up on the objectively reasonable standard? Do we have a thought in mind of how that determination who is going to make the determination of what constitutes objectively reasonable? Is the commission going to be involved? Is it going to be a delegated act to the division, or are we just going to, as an agency, sort of require or meet that the agency sort of, or the DCM meet this standard on its own?
I'm sorry to interrupt, Commissioner. This is Dorothy again, and I would like to amplify what Marilee said in response to your clarification question. Objectively reasonable is ultimately determined by the Commission. There are ways that happens. For example, in rule enforcement reviews, there are examinations, and if the staff believes something is objectively unreasonable, as described before, it will issue a deficiency finding that is subject to Commission, that is part of a rule efficiency review report, subject to Commission review and approval through potentially different types of processes. There's currently one in place. In addition, if the staff feels that something is objectively reasonable, it can refer that over to enforcement. And again, it's a Commission's decision as to whether to pursue an enforcement action. So the Commission has the ultimate determination in both paths as to what is objectively reasonable.
Thanks, Dorothy. That's extremely helpful. I want to turn quickly to the significant disruptions reporting to the Commission, and I think, Joe, you mentioned this in your presentation. I guess as a general matter, is there current in the sort of status quo, what we do right now from a DMO perspective, are there instances where a quote unquote significant disruption that may occur within a trading system or at a DCM is not reported to the Commission? So are we adding anything in this proposal that we don't otherwise do with respect to significant disruptions in the marketplace?
Thank you, Commissioner. This is Joe Ochin. So currently, the proposed rule is in some ways analogous to the current existing regulation with respect to system safeguards that requires DCMs to report, quote, significant system safeguards incidents to the Commission. So the proposed rule, is different in that it requires reporting of significant market disruptions, and so. I'm not sure, in terms of factually, I think that we do have a fairly good, back and forth with DCMs in terms of them alerting us to significant incidents that happen. But in terms of sort of the rules and the requirements of Part 38, we do feel that this, while it's analogous to the system safeguards rules, we do feel that it's clearly distinguishable and that clearly would be, an addition to Part 38 in terms of the rule text.
Thanks, Joe. And if we could quickly follow up on that, or at least pivot a little bit, but staying close to significant disruptions, has the division thought about the differences between significant disruptions and market disruptions? And I maybe carelessly used those words interchangeably in my previous question, but I think it'd be helpful to understand how the division is thinking about the differences, if there are any, between those two concepts, significant and market.
Sure, this is Joe Ochin again. So a significant market disruption would include a situation where the ability of other market participants to execute trades, engage in price discovery, or otherwise manage their risk is materially impacted by a malfunction of a participant's trading system. So certainly we could envision a given market participant having a technological issue that doesn't rise to that level of a significant disruption that impinges upon other market participants in the market. So market volatility by itself would not necessarily constitute a significant market disruption. So, for example, the fact of a limit up or limit down being reached on its own, that wouldn't necessarily constitute a significant market disruption. So I do think that under the proposal, it would have to meet a certain threshold in terms of its impact, on the DCM's trading platform and on other market participants accessing it before it reaches the level of a significant disruption.
Thanks, Joe. And I'll wrap up here, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. Have I gone way over my 10 minutes here? Should I reserve this last question or wrap up now?
No, just feel free to continue.
Okay. So just this one last question. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The division decided not to define expressly market disruption, system anomaly, electronic trading. And I think that, dovetails consistently with what the chairman said about principles-based regulation. And in many ways, I understand that and appreciate the decision to not define these terms sort of in a static way. But if Dorothy, you or the team could share sort of what was the thinking behind having more of a commission view on what these terms mean, market disruption, system anomaly, electronic trading, as opposed to expressly defining them. And I point this out just because, on the one hand, I, again, appreciate the benefit of principles-based regulation in many circumstances, but do we run the risk in this particular circumstance where there is reserved many authorities for the agency to act in enforcement capacity or in oversight capacity through rule enforcement reviews or otherwise, that by leaving it up to the commission to sort of describe or share our view of what these terms mean, it creates a little bit more uncertainty for registrants about what our view is, and potentially an evolving view depending on the commission in place at the time. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. This is Joe Ochin again. So various terms, as you note, including market disruption, system anomaly, are not defined in the proposed rule text. And they're not defined so that the application of the risk principles by both DCMs and the Commission can evolve over time along with market developments. However, we do note that the NPRM does include a general discussion of those terms in the context of today's electronic markets to provide the public, and in particular DCMs, with guidance for applying the risk principles. And I'll also note that the NPRM asked questions for the public regarding the preamble's discussions of those terms. And certainly we look forward to seeing the comments that come in.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that. And again, thanks to Dorothy, Joe, for your presentation, Mary Lee, as well, yours. And thanks to the entire DMO staff, OC, OGC, who participated in this. I'll probably have a question or two and read a statement in the second round, but thanks, Mr. Chairman, and my fellow commissioners for being patient here.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will be very brief. I actually have no questions. I just want to make a very brief statement. It's a fact that the markets we regulate have become increasingly electronic, much like everything else in our modern lives. And I believe, as has been recognized by others, that the market infrastructure providers have already implemented a host of measures pursuant to our existing regulations and their self-regulatory responsibilities to account for this transition and the associated risk. I will vote favorably to seek public comment on the need for additional commission-prescribed risk principles expected to be applied by all DCMs, and I will reserve judgment on any final rule accordingly. But I have reservations about any suggestion that adequate attention has not already been invested in responding to these lessons that the exchanges and the Commission have already learned and applied as electronic trading has become more prevalent in these markets. With that, I will turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Berkowitz, and I have a few questions. Some of them, the discussion has already started by the questions and answers of other commissioners, and so I'll build off those. I do want to say at the outset, just echoing what something that others have said, and Commissioner Stump just preceded me. I want to make it clear that my discussion and my consideration of this issue, I first came to this. I was at the Commission during the flash crash, and that was a big event in those days. And I wasn't at the Commission for Reg AT, and now I'm back at the Commission. But I have seen through my time at the Commission and involved with these markets a significant evolution in the market's ability to deal with electronic trading, and there have been significant advances in electronic trading. So a lot, as others have noted, there's been a significant evolution in electronic trading. There's been a significant evolution in the Commission's understanding of electronic trading, and I think we need to recognize that there's been a significant evolution in the exchange's response to it and in the controls that they have put on. They've learned a lot, and they have put in a number of measures that have, as the staff has noted in the preamble notes, they've taken significant steps to address the risks posed by electronic trading. So the question is today, going forward, what additional needs to be done? What are the risks, and how should the Commission approach it? So I want to recognize that as a base. What we're talking about, as Commissioner Benham said, is different from what the Commission was dealing with in 2014, 2015, 2016, et cetera, as Reg AT was being evolved. There's always a several-year lag, actually, between the time a serious problem is identified and you get proposed regulation on the books, you get comments on it, you repropose it, consider those comments, and that easily can chew up 4 to 5 years. And meanwhile, the market has developed. So I also believe Reg AT, what might have been proposed 3 or 4 years ago, may not be timely right now, but I do not agree with the concept that is in the withdrawal, that there's absolutely nothing in that document that's worthy of our consideration at all. I think that's a much too strong rejection of all the work and all the thought that went into that and many of the ideas that were put forth. And let's also not forget that went through an iteration where the Commission proposed, the industry responded, the Commission changed its proposal in response to those comments. And I find benefit in that discussion, and I think the Commission's total withdrawal of that and rejection of absolutely anything in that document is too much. So I think some of the things in Reg AT are not appropriate in today's market, but other things in Reg AT may be, and I think the Commission should be considering a number of those things, or at least get public comment on it. So I'm not supportive of the withdrawal of Reg AT. Reg AT in that form can't be adopted by the Commission today, but I don't think we should dismiss all consideration of everything that was, all the work that was done that went into that at this time. But moving forward, this debate today is not about Reg AT, it's about where do we go from here. I want to ask, I think some of the questions are, some of the statements that have been made is that DCM's currently addressing most, if not all, of the risks encompassed by the risk principles that may not accept DCMs to adopt new rules. They're currently addressing many of these risks, existing practices today consistent with risk principle 1, existing acceptable practices for the core principle 4 would satisfy risk principle 2. So I'm wondering, if the exchanges are already in compliance pretty much with this, and this isn't going to require anything new, then what are we getting at here, and what difference will this make? Are we just putting another reg on the book? So let me ask again, just to clarify, what is the delta? What are we getting under these risk principles that we don't have under current law? What is the regulatory delta, so to speak, between current law and these risk principles?
Thank you for that question, Commissioner. So it's definitely a good question. I think one existing regulation that's somewhat perhaps most relevant here would be existing 38255, which also requires risk controls. Under that regulation, a DCM is required to have risk controls on its own system to address market disruptions, including restrictions that pause or halt trading. So what the risk principle, at least number 2, provides is that it really gives additional clarity to DCMs. So it also specifically addresses electronic trading. In addition, we make very clear in the preamble that we now consider market disruptions very broadly to address not only extreme price movements, but other disruptive behavior that might impair the ability of market participants to access the market and manage risk. So hopefully that answers, your question that, while there may be a bit of overlap, and we do certainly require risk controls already. These principles get more specifically at electronic trading. We want to make very clear we're getting at more than extreme price movements, and hopefully these principles will provide increased clarity to DCMs on what our expectations are in terms of preventing and mitigating risk.
Okay, so I guess, is it fair or is it obvious to characterize this, what we're doing as a principles-based approach?
I would call this principles-based. We do call them risk principles, and we did strive to be flexible and offer the DCM, reasonable discretion in terms of how to comply with them. We do know that they've done a lot of work in this area already to address risk, and they really are, well aware of what the risks are to their markets and how to best address those risks. And so these are principles, and hopefully they will work to prevent risk and also, be flexible enough to allow for, continued evolution in terms of technology and the market.
Let me just so the listeners, for clarity's sake, we've talked about Regulation 38255 and the current regulation. That's the basis for this discussion, but I think it helps to be explicit in comparing the new proposed risk principles 1 and 2 with where we are. So the new proposed risk principle 1, which would be 38.251E, which is risk principle 1, which says the DCM must adopt and implement rules governing market participants subject to its jurisdiction to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. I'm not sure everybody who's listening would have these exact words, so I think it's helpful for me to specify the words. Adopt and implement rules governing market participants subject to its jurisdiction to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. 38251F, which is risk principle 2, says subject all electronic orders to exchange-based free trade risk controls to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. So 1 goes to adopt and implement rules governing market participants, and 2 is subject all electronic orders. So there's 1 governing market participants, 2, the other is electronic orders. And they both seek to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. 38255, the existing regulation, says the designated contract market must establish and maintain risk control mechanisms to prevent and reduce the potential risk of price distortions and market disruptions, including but not limited to market restrictions that pause or halt trading and market conditions prescribed by the designated contract market. So we've already got a principles-based regulation, 38255, based on core principle 4. 38255 says they must establish and maintain risk control mechanisms to prevent, reduce the potential risk of price distortions and market disruptions. Now we're implementing two more. One is to market participants to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions. And then electronic orders, the risk controls DCM must subject all electronic orders to exchange-based pre-risk controls to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions. And the reason we're doing this is to get more explicitly, if the answer was to get more explicitly electronic orders, it more explicitly covers market participants. And there was concern that the current regulation might be too focused on sudden price movements, although I don't read it that way, but that concern is reflected to a certain degree in the preamble. So basically what we're saying is we need more specificity, that there's a lack of prescriptivity in the current regulation. We have a very, very broad principles-based regulation, but we need to be more prescriptive. We need to say this specifically has to subject electronic orders. We specifically say that it governs market participants. So we have a principles-based regulation already, but what we're saying here today is we need more specificity in our regulations. We need to be more specific as to how this applies and to whom it applies. And I fully agree with that. I couldn't agree more with the position the Commission's taking today, that its current principles-based approach is too high level and it needs more specificity. My concern is, or my question is, are we specific enough? And specificity and prescriptivity, we can talk philosophically about it's this or it's that, but it's really getting it right. And so in some cases, you want specificity. In other cases, you don't want specificity. But here, what we're saying is the market has evolved since 38255 was put in initially. The market's evolved, and we've learned more. So we want the DCMs to have rules governing market participants, and we want them to have rules specifically and explicitly dealing with electronic orders, and that specificity and that prescriptivity is not in the current regulation. So let's be more specific. So we can talk about principles-based whatever, but they can't be too high, and they can't be too general, and they can't be too broad. There has to be some level of specificity in these things to make them meaningful. It would be meaningless for the Commission to pass a regulation that would say basically the DCM shall address all the risks before it. Well, that's a pretty high-level principles-based regulation. DCM should address all the risks before it and do it in a reasonable way. And we'll just, figure out whether you're being reasonable or not. We could throw out the whole CFR on that basis, and intermediaries too. Reasonably address the risks coming before you. But we don't do that. Some areas we give the DCM's discretion. Some areas we give the DCM's guidance, and that's appropriate too. And the chairman's actually, the chairman, you've written an excellent article going into where and when the different types of approaches are appropriate. I commend you on 23 single-spaced pages in the Harvard Business Review for spelling all these circumstances out and when one approach would be appropriate and another approach, more prescriptive approach, would be appropriate. But on the subject that we're dealing with today, I think we have to be balanced in our view as to how much specificity and how much prescriptivity is appropriate, and not take a general overall philosophical view one way or the other, but let's see what's particularly appropriate to the circumstances. I'm reminded, I was reminded as I was thinking about this issue of the movie that I saw a number of years ago, the movie Amadeus, and there's the great scene in Amadeus where it's about Mozart and his feud or his rivalry, I should say, with the other great composer at the time, Salieri. And I listen to classical music, but I'm not a classical music expert or historian or whatever. And I might have heard music by Salieri, but he was another great composer. He just had the misfortune of being in Vienna at the same time Mozart was there, and so Mozart totally overshadowed him. And another time, Salieri, everybody might know who Salieri is, but Mozart was such a prodigy and got all the attention. And it was about the movie's about the jealousy of and the rivalry between Salieri and Mozart. But there's the famous scene in the movie when Mozart premieres a symphony for the Emperor Joseph, and the emperor, and it's reportedly a true story. The emperor said to Mozart, "Too many notes, dear Mozart, too many notes." And Mozart's reply was, "Just as many as necessary, Your Majesty." So the degree of prescriptivity and degree of specificity, I would think, is just as many as necessary, Mr. Chairman, just as many as necessary. So I've got some more specific questions on a less philosophical vein. I'll leave those for the second round. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Berkovitz. Well, let me just simply sort of, I guess, so we'll start round two now, and I think I'm going to be very quick, but let me just sort of respond to some of the things that others have said, particularly my colleagues. So I do agree that, first of all, this is additive. And when I espouse a principles-based approach, again, I don't mean we just have vacuous statements that are entirely meaningless. You need to have principles with a certain degree of specificity so market participants actually know what they're doing. How can you reasonably design something to achieve something if you don't know that which you wish to achieve or what you're directed to achieve? So I do think we're providing greater specificity, but at the same time, we're not being totally prescriptive. We could have 25 pages of regulation saying, thou shalt do these 28 things or something like that. We're not doing that here. So I would agree that what we have right now is sort of broad, and some could argue so broad that it's somewhat vacuous. And so what we are doing here is we are keeping and advancing a principles-based approach, but those principles are meaningful and they're specific enough that market participants are able to make reasonable decisions as to whether they're complying or not. So I think it's a step forward in that direction, and I agree with your overall analysis. As for the movie Amadeus, which I think won Best Picture in 1984, I'm going to admit that I am a big fan of that movie as well. And in a thrift shop about 6 weeks ago, I actually found the entire soundtrack on CD and purchased it. I think it's from 1984, and so great movie, great reference. And getting rules right may not be as hard as writing the great operas of Don Giovanni or the Magic Flute, or even as arduous as writing the Requiem. But it is, we're trying to sort of get it right, and I think you hit it spot on that it's more of an art in many ways than just a science. In my article, I tried to sort of at least provide some kind of framework for these are kind of areas where they tend to be more principle, and these are others where they should be more rule-based. But at the end of the day, regulation is probably as much of an art. Sound regulation is about much of it being an art as it is about being a science. So we move forward today on that basis. And then finally on Reg AT, first of all, I think there are 3 points in the Reg AT withdrawal, 3 attributes or 3 things that Reg AT does that I think, we say we do reject, but only 3, and not necessarily everything in Reg AT as proposed. My biggest reason for supporting to withdrawal it is the fact that, I don't believe we can move final or finalize anything. I think even if people wanted to move forward on aspects of AT, it would have to be reproposed. And so my litmus test for this is not, who voted for it and was it partisan, was it bipartisan, but really, is it something that needs to be proposed, reproposed? And if the answer is yes, then my view is it should be withdrawn. when I got to this job last summer, there were probably 20 different things that were laying out there that were kind of unopened or unfinished, I should say. And really my focus has been on giving the market the clarity. And my view is if we're not going to move forward with it and finalize it, then I believe it should be withdrawn. And to your point, Commissioner, or your concern, Commissioner Benham, which I totally understand, that it was done in a bipartisan fashion. You have my word that I will withdraw things in a bipartisan fashion as well, or ask the Commission to withdraw things. So this AT happened to be under a Democratic party, someone with a Democratic affiliation as chair, but I fully intend to withdraw things that have also been proposed under a Republican chair, which it's become clear perhaps that the Commission is not going to move forward with finalizing. So I share the concern, but my view is we'll withdraw everything that meets the test that I laid out. If we don't plan on finalizing it, and we'd have to repropose it even if we wanted to finalize aspects of it, then my view is I will put it before the Commission to withdraw so we have a clean slate. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Commissioner Quintens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Quintens. I think I'm going to go through my statement. I don't have any questions for the staff, and I'd like to acknowledge their work, but I'll do that towards the end. I hope everyone can forgive me for not including Amadeus references in my statement, but it's a little too late to try to change it to be consistent. Let me just say that I support today's proposal that will require designated contract markets to adopt rules that are reasonably designed to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. And as we've heard, it will also require DCMs to subject all electronic orders to pre-trade risk controls that are reasonably designed to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions, and to provide prompt notice to the Commission in the event the platform experiences any significant market disruptions. I believe that all DCMs have already adopted regulations and pre-trade risk controls designed to address the risks posed by electronic trading. As I noted previously today and many other times, I think many, if not all, of the risks posed by electronic trading are already being effectively addressed through the market's incentive structure, including exchanges and firms' own self-interest in implementing best practices. Therefore, today's proposal, in my view, merely codifies the existing market practice of DCMs to understand their markets, have reasonable controls in place to mitigate electronic trading risks, and to continue to evolve in their thinking and how those should be reasonably applied. Significantly, the proposal puts forth what is, in my view, a truly principles-based approach, allowing DCM trading and risk management controls to continue to evolve with the trading technology itself. As we've witnessed over the past decade, risk controls are constantly being updated and improved to respond to market developments. It's my view that these continuous enhancements are made possible because exchanges and firms have both the flexibility and the incentives to evolve and hold themselves to an ever higher set of standards, rather than being held to a set of prescriptive regulatory requirements which can quickly become obsolete or calibrated inappropriately to begin with. By adopting a principles-based approach, the proposal would provide exchanges and market participants with the flexibility they need to innovate and evolve with technological developments. As the preamble to this proposal states explicitly, quote, DCMs are well positioned to determine and implement the rules and risk controls most effective for their markets. And under the proposed rule, DCMs would be required to adopt and implement rules and risk controls that are objectively reasonable. And reasonableness is a generous concept. The Commission would monitor DCMs for compliance and take action if it determines that DCM's rules and risk controls are objectively unreasonable. And as was mentioned by the staff, and as is mentioned throughout the preamble, the Technology Advisory Committee, which I am very honored to sponsor, over the last 2 years has explored the risks posed by electronic trading at length, as well as the responses to those risks by exchanges. And in each of those discussions, it's become obvious that both DCMs and market participants take the risks of electronic trading seriously and have expended enormous effort and resources to address those risks. As I think Marley described, or maybe Joe, we heard how CME at one TAC meeting, how the CME group has implemented trading and volatility controls that complement and in some cases exceed the 8 recommendations published by IOSCO regarding practices to manage volatility and preserve orderly trading. We heard from the FIA about current best practices for electronic trading risk controls. FIA also reported that through its survey of exchanges and clearing firms and trading firms, it has found widespread adoption of market integrity controls since 2010, including price banding and exchange market halts. FIA also previewed some of the next generation controls and best practices currently being developed by exchanges and firms to further refine and improve electronic trading systems, all of which were happening in absence of the proposal that we have before us today. The Intercontinental Exchange presented on the risk controls that they currently implement across all of ICE's exchanges, noting how its implementation of controls was fully consistent with FIA's best practices. These presentations emphasize how critical it is for the Commission to adopt principles-based approaches that enable best practices to evolve over time. I believe the proposal issued today adopts such an approach and provides DCMs with the flexibility to continue to improve their risk controls in response to technological and market advancements. I look forward to the comments on this proposal. Lastly, I would like very much to thank the staff, to Dorothy, to Marley, to Joe, Rachel from DMO for the time that they took in speaking to me and to my staff about this proposal and their thinking. I would also like to specifically thank the chairman and Andrew Ridenour from his staff for their tireless and constant communication on this proposal. But I would particularly like to acknowledge and thank Kevin Webb of my staff for the intense amount of work and attention to detail and brainstorming on this proposal over the past month. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to supporting the proposal today.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Benham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will also reserve my time in the second round for my statement. But before I do, just again, a quick thank you to the entire staff for their work, for working with my office, and in particular, John Dunphy, who helped me work through these issues and as we discussed them. And as always, division staff, in this case, DMO, was receptive, worked well, and was very frank in sort of sharing their views so that we could work through this in a positive way. I strongly support thoughtful and meaningful policy that addresses the use of automated systems in our markets. As Chris Clearfield of System Logic, a research and consulting firm focusing on issues of risk and complexity, remarked, quote, "In every situation, a trader or a piece of technology might fail, or a shock might trigger a liquidity event. What's important is that structures are in place to limit, not amplify, the impact on the overall system. Any rule that we put forward should both minimize the potential for market disruptions and other operational problems that may arise from the automation or order origination, transmission, or execution, and create structures to absorb and buffer breakdowns when they occur. Unfortunately, today's proposal regarding electronic trading risk principles does not meaningfully achieve this, and thus I respectfully dissent. A little over 10 years ago, on May 6, 2010, the flash crash shook our markets. The prices of many U.S.-based products, including stock index futures, experienced an extraordinarily rapid decline in recovery. After this event, the staffs of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and CFTC issued a report to the joint CFTC-SEC Advisory Committee on Emerging Regulatory Issues. The report noted that, quote, "One key lesson is that under stressed market conditions, the automated execution of a large sell order can trigger extreme price movements, especially if the automated execution algorithm does not take prices into account. Moreover, the interaction between automated execution programs and algorithmic trading strategies can quickly erode liquidity and result in disorderly markets." In 2012, Knight Capital, a securities trading firm, suffered losses of more than $460 million due to a trading software coding error. Other volatility events related to automated trading have followed with increasing regularity. Since 2016, the Commission has not advanced policy designed to prevent or restrain the impact of these market disruptions resulting from automated trading. While the Commission has not acted, these events have continued to occur. In September and October 2019, the euro-dollar futures market experienced a significant increase in messaging. According to reports, the volume of data generated by activity in euro-dollar futures increased tenfold. The DCM responded by changing its rules to increase penalties for exceeding certain messaging thresholds and cutting off connections for repeat violators. The DCM acted appropriately in such a situation and strengthened its rules for its participants. However, Commission policy could well have prevented this event by requiring pre-trade risk controls, including messaging thresholds. Given the importance of the issue, I would like to commend again the Chairman for stepping forward with a proposal today. However, as I considered this proposal, I found myself questioning what the proposed risk principles do differently than the current status quo. The preamble seems to go to great lengths to make it clear that the Commission is not actually asking DCMs to do anything differently than they do today. The preamble states that the Commission, quote, believes that DCMs are addressing most, if not all, of the electronic trading risks currently presented to their trading platforms, close quote. As the preamble discusses each of the three new risk principles, it goes on to describe all the actions taken by DCMs today that meet the principles. The fact that the Commission is not asking DCMs to do anything new is clearest in the cost-benefit analysis, which states that DCM's current risk management practices, particularly those implemented to comply with existing regulations, already may comply with the requirements of the proposed rules. If the appropriate structures are in place, and we have dutifully conducted our DCM rule enforcement reviews and have found neither deficiencies nor areas for improvement, then is this exercise before us today anything more than creating a box to check? The only potentially new aspect of this proposal is that the preamble suggests different application in the future as circumstances change. The Commission seems to want it both ways. We want to reassure DCMs that what they do now is enough, but at the same time, the new risk principles potentially provide a blank check for the Commission to apply them differently in the future. Or perhaps view differently, when there is a technology failure, and there will be one, will the Commission stand by its principles, or will it fashion an enforcement action around a black swan event so that everyone walks away a little bruised but not harmed? For market participants, this may be extremely confusing. What precisely are DCMs being asked to do, and what will they be asked to do in the future? Frankly, I'm not sure, but it could be more than they bargained for. The first risk principle requires DCMs to, quote, adopt and implement rules to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions or system anomalies associated with electronic trading. None of the key terms in this principle are defined in the regulation or the preamble. DCMs are left some clues, but they are not told precisely what a market disruption or system anomaly is. Perhaps most importantly, they are not told what it means for something to be, quote, reasonably designed to prevent these things. This lack of clarity continues through the other two new risk principles. And while the Commission provides some clues by stating that current practice may meet the new principles, it then goes on to say that future circumstances may require future action by DCMs in order to comply with the principles. As a recent article by our chairman in the Harvard Business Law Review points out, the CFTC has a long tradition of principles-based regulation. The concept runs through our core principles, which form the framework for much of what we do now and how we regulate. It certainly is tempting to promulgate broad rules that provide the CFTC with flexibility to react to changes in the marketplace. The problem is that this flexibility comes at a number of costs. It potentially denies market participants the certainty they need to make business decisions. And if the principles are too flexible, it denies market participants the notice and opportunity to comment as required by the Administrative Procedures Act. These costs become too high, whereas today we promulgate rules that are too broad in their terms and too vague in application. There is reason why the core principles for swap execution facilities and derivatives clearing organizations in our rule set are extensive, and why the regulations include appendices explaining Commission interpretation and acceptable practices. Without sufficient clarity, principles actually can become a vehicle for government overreach, a sort of blank check for broad government action, and that includes enforcement action. There's a saying in basketball that a good zone defense looks a lot like a man-to-man defense, and a good man-to-man defense looks a lot like a good zone defense. I think the same can be said of principles-based regulation and rules-based regulation. Good principles-based regulation should look a lot like rules-based regulation. It should have enough clarity to provide market participants with certainty and the opportunity to provide comment regarding what regulation will look like. It's worth noting that the Commission described the unanimously approved Reg AT proposal as principles-based. Multiple commenters to that proposal noted that it was too principles-based. I suspect that each of us on the Commission believes that the CFTC has a tradition of principles-based regulation and that that tradition should continue. However, I think there is a disagreement with precisely what that means. Finally, I want to make a few comments on the vote regarding the withdrawal of Reg AT. On the one hand, the risk principles proposal today expressly is not about automated or algorithmic trading. This applies to electronic trading generally. Yet there seems to be a perception that this is a replacement for Reg AT, and that is already reflected in some media accounts of our action today. And if there is any question, the Commission is separately voting on withdrawal of Reg AT at the same time it's issuing this NPRM. Separate vote specifically to withdraw a prior Commission proposal is highly unusual, particularly in a situation where, as here, the original proposal was unanimously issued. Mr. Chairman, separately, I recognize your comments that you made in response to my point earlier, and I appreciate them. And I appreciate the opportunity to vote, as this would sort of display the differences we have, which hopefully, as we continue to have a healthy relationship, we'll work through. I believe that this action establishes a dangerous precedent for a Commission that has historically prided itself on its collegiality and its efforts to work in a bipartisan fashion. I've followed in a tradition of some of my predecessors on the Commission, at times voting for proposals that I would not have supported as final rules solely for the purpose of advancing the conversation. I worry that the withdrawal of Reg AT could lead to future withdrawals of Commission proposals and a loss of this historic collegiality. We should be standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, not tearing down what came before us. Market participants expressed valid concerns to the original Reg AT, and I share some of those concerns, as they do with many of our proposals. But market displeasure with just one or even a few of those original policy concepts is not a reason to throw away the rest of the proposal and rejecting it full stop. Let's revisit, let's review, and let's refresh sound policy to better reflect modern market structure and a healthy relationship between market participant and the market regulator. I firmly believe we collectively strive for the same goal in this circumstance and others: safe, transparent, orderly, and fair markets. Unfortunately, today's proposal does not advance the conversation, and as such, I cannot support it. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your time, and my fellow commissioners, and of course, thanks to DMO and all the staff who put a lot of time and work into this. I appreciate your efforts, as always. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Stump. I do not have a formal closing statement or statement with regard to this rule. I've listened with great interest, and I think for anyone who's tuned into this meeting who might not spend a lot of time with the CFTC, it is probably obvious that to get this proposal to where it is today has been the result of a very spirited debate behind the scenes among all of the 5 commissioners, as well as a tremendous number of the agency's staff. So I just want to commend again the staff for handling that situation in a very in a remarkable way, quite frankly, and in a very respectful way, and I very much appreciate the time and energy that has been put into this proposal. But with that, I will turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one additional question, and then I have my prepared statement and also some additional remarks I'll add to that. And this goes to the significant disruption. Now, is it correct that the Principle 3 requires the DCMs to report significant disruptions, but that the rules need to be designed just to prevent disruptions? Is that correct? That we're not permitting, we're not only the rule and the principles address all types of disruptions, not just significant disruptions. Is that correct? Risk Principle 1 and 2.
Thank you. This is Marilee Dahlman. Thank you for that question. The first 2 principles do not have that qualifier. So, yeah, they are geared more generally to disruptions. The notification requirement it does have that significant threshold. for notice. So it is slightly different, but in terms of disruptions, the key element is that really what's significant for us is that the disruption in some way impacts the ability of other participants to trade or, in some other way manage their risk.
Okay. Thank you. So I will. I have my remarks, and I will add on to that. So I am going to vote in favor of issuing for public comment the proposed rule on electronic trading principles. The proposal is a limited step to address potential market disruptions arising from system errors or malfunctions in electronic trading. Although it leaves important issues unaddressed, the proposal recognizes the need to update our regulations to keep pace with the speed, interconnection, and automation of modern markets. I support the Commission's long overdue re-engagement in this area. While I support issuing the proposed rule for comment, I do not support withdrawing Regulation AT. As I've said, the notice of withdrawal reflects a belief that there's nothing of value in Reg AT, and that is simply not true. Reg AT was a comprehensive approach for addressing automated trading in commission-regulated markets. Certain elements may have been a bridge too far. However, I applaud that proposal's efforts to identify the sources of risk and implement meaningful risk controls. I believe the comments received on Reg AT are worth evaluating going forward. In terms of the risk principles in the proposal, while worthwhile as statements of principles, these proposed requirements are drafted in terms that might ultimately prove too high level to achieve the goal of effectively preventing, detecting, and mitigating market disruptions and system anomalies. This concern is discussed in greater detail in my written statement, and I look forward to public comment on this issue. The proposed rule includes acceptable practices in Appendix B to Part 38, which provide that the DCM can comply with the risk principles through rules and risk controls that are reasonably designed to prevent, detect, and mitigate market disruptions and system anomalies. The proposed rule specifies that reasonableness is an objective measure, and that a DCM rule or risk control that is not reasonably designed would not satisfy the acceptable practices or the risk principles. As the proposal indicates, the Commission will monitor the DCM's compliance with risk principles, and as the staff has explained in the presentation, the Commission has multiple oversight activities at its disposal, including market surveillance activities, reviews of new rule certifications and approval requests, and rule enforcement reviews. And for me, one very significant aspect of this proposal is that it's clear on the fundamental division of authority under the Commodity Exchange Act between DCMs and the Commission. And this is a point that is sometimes lost or not fully appreciated when we're talking about principles-based regulation. Amendments to the Commodity Exchange Act made through the Commodity Futures Modernization Act in 2000 introduced the core principle regime and provided DCMs with flexibility in establishing how they comply with the core principle. 10 years later, learning from the 2008 financial crisis and the excesses of deregulation, the Dodd-Frank Act overhauled the CEA, including in its treatment of the core principle regime. Specifically, Section 735 of the Dodd-Frank Act made clear that a DCM's discretion with respect to core principle compliance was circumscribed by any rule or regulation that the Commission might adopt pursuant to a core principle. I'm able to support today's proposed rule for publication in the Federal Register because improvements that clarify the respective authorities between the DCM and the Commission. Under the CEA, the Commission is the ultimate arbiter of whether a DCM's rules and risk controls are reasonably designed under an objective standard. I want to thank the Chairman and my colleagues for working on this issue and arriving at consensus in this regard. And let me just give some slight additional history on this. When I was at the Commission the first time prior to the was at the Commission for about a year before the Dodd-Frank Act was enacted into law. We were working on it then. And this issue, the core principles under the CFMA were the operative regime. And there were a number of instances where the staff felt really under the existing CFMA, where at that time the CFMA says the exchanges shall have reasonable discretion in establishing the manner in which the Board of Trade complies with the core principles. So the exchanges, the DCMs were given reasonable discretion, and basically to find that the DCM was not complying with the core principle, you had to essentially find a violation of the Commodity Exchange Act. It was an extremely high standard, and there were a number of instances, and the exchanges, I don't think the CFTC ever was able to tell an exchange that its practices were unacceptable under the core principles. In 2009, the CFTC and the SEC prepared a joint report on harmonization of SEC and CFTC regulations and sent that report to Congress. And in that report, the CFTC recommended that this authority be clarified. The report that CFTC sent up to Congress, I'm just going to quote briefly from it, said the Commodity Futures Modernization Act significantly limited the CFTC's authority over the rules of exchanges and clearinghouses subject to its oversight. The CFTC does not have clear authority, for example, to set rules for risk management for exchanges and clearinghouses. The CFTC's authority contrasts with the authority of other regulators, such as the SEC or regulators in foreign jurisdictions. In the near future, the CFTC will be expected to regulate not only the futures market, but also a large section of what currently is the over-the-counter market for derivatives and possibly emissions trading. Absent clear rulemaking authority, the CFTC is limited in its ability to enforce core principles, to adapt to market conditions and international standards, and to protect the public. To provide the CFTC with sufficient ability to ensure that exchanges and clearinghouses regulated under its authority are operating within the principles, rules, and regulations established under the CEA should be amended to provide the CFTC with clear authority with respect to exchanges and clearinghouse rules that the CFTC finds are necessary for them to comply with the CEA. The CEA should be amended to, 1, clarify the CFTC's rulemaking authority to determine the appropriate manner by which an exchange or clearinghouse may comply with the CEA. So those are the recommendations, and they were adopted by Congress. And that's why the Commodity Exchange Act today, if you look at the core principles that exist for DCMs and CEFs and others, and the provision saying reasonable discretion of contract market, there's the introductory clause that says, unless otherwise determined by the Commission by rule or regulation, a Board of Trade shall have reasonable discretion in establishing the manner in which complies with the core principles. So this is something that the CFTC, back in those days, felt very strongly about, recommended to Congress, and the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress clarified the CFTC's authority, that we have the authority by rule or regulation to set the manner. So to have a rule or regulation that would just say the DCMs have reasonable discretion to do X would go back to the pre-Dodd-Frank, in my view, would go back to the pre-Dodd-Frank world where it just said the exchanges have reasonable discretion, and CFTC, based on that experience, felt that it had inadequate authority. So how do you have a principles-based regime that ties this together? And I think I've had many discussions with the chairman on this issue about the respective authorities of the Commission and the exchanges. And I'm very pleased to see in this document that we are setting forth the standard that we believe that we set forth an objective standard of reasonableness. And, we talk about prescriptivity or non-prescriptivity. You can put it in a regulation, you can put it in acceptable practices, or you can put it in a preamble. How are we going to say it's objectively reasonable? Well, if you start talking and we make references to current industry standards, we talk about IOSCO standards, we talk about the TAC recommendations, and the best practices in the industry and say we're going to look for that as to what's reasonable. We can build in what objectively reasonable is, and effectively, I believe we can effectively get there. At the same time, recognizing that exactly how the controls are set up, the exchanges have to have some discretion. We're not going to set the numbers of the throttle limits and all that. They have to have some discretion in that area. But, the types of throttle limits, look to the TAC recommendations, look to best practices, and that will determine what the objective standard is. But ultimately, we have the final say, and that's appropriate, and that reflects, I think, congressional intent. So this approach and this structure, this sort of being, I think, one of the first revisions of like the core principle approach, in my view, this is the correct approach, and it's one significant reason that I'm supporting this today, because I think it appropriately balances the respective authorities here. Now, obviously, what's objectively reasonable. Exchanges will have their views and we'll have our views. And if we disagree at court, we'll decide it. Hopefully it doesn't get there. But I think it sets the parameters of the debate very well. So to me, this is a critical component of this here. When we talk about principles-based, sometimes the authority, like who decides when we talk about reasonable discretion, who's going to be the ultimate decision maker? And I'm very pleased to see that this recognizes the commission as the ultimate decision maker. I thank the chairman and my colleagues for all the work that went into this issue over the past several weeks. In that regard, I thank the chairman and his staff and other commissioners and their staff who worked on this and Division of Market Oversight, as well as my staff, Sebastian Peugeot, for his. I don't know, Sebastian was like, get my emails at midnight, and then I see his at 5:39 in the morning. So I hope you got some sleep the past few weeks. So anyway, that's a significant factor in my determination to put this out for a proposal. As I've said, I'm still concerned that it's not specific enough, but I'll look forward to public comments on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Berkovitz, and again, thank you to everyone that played a role in this proposal. I do think out of all of our proposals, more time has been spent on these 60 pages of commissioners' principal level engagement than perhaps some of our other rules. So very grateful for everyone. So with that, is there any commissioner who is not prepared to vote? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I'm so sorry to interrupt. This is Rachel Bervancy. Can I just clarify an answer to one question that was raised during the Q&A period?
Sure, please go ahead.
I'm sorry. There was a question. I think it was regarding the significant disruption, and I think we may have answered it incorrectly. I mean, our view is that the term market disruptions, for purposes of the risk principles, generally would include an event originating with a market participant that significantly disrupts the operation of the DCM on which such participant is trading. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for all your input as the head of our exams branch on this rule. So with that, is there any commissioner who is not prepared to vote?
Well, no. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Berkovitz again. I want to make sure I understand. So, the rule text reads that it prevents. They're supposed to have rules that prevent market disruptions, but it's what we're saying is that only. And then the 1 and 2 talks about market disruptions. Principle 3 applies to. They have to notify us of significant disruption. So do they not have to have rules that prevent disruptions, or the rules, are they only required to have rules that prevent significant disruptions? And those would be defined as something that materially affect other market participants.
Who would like to respond from CMO staff?
Yeah, this is Marilee Dahlman again. So certainly we do want the DCM to be considering market disruption fairly broadly, but it does, their rules and their controls do need to apply specifically to significant disruptions. So in that regard, the significant standards, will apply to principles 1 and 2.
And then again, a significant disruption is defined as something that materially affects another market participant.
Yeah. So if you have a malfunction that doesn't materially affect other participants, then it wouldn't be considered a disruption. So volatility on its own, is not disruptive. There has to be, some kind of malfunction that also in some way materially affects the ability of other participants to trade.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I will take that final question and answer as an indication that everyone now, with the benefit of what I think has been a great presentation, followed by a great Q&A period and discussion among commissioners, that everyone is ready to vote. So Mr. Kirkpatrick, and again, we're going to have 2 separate votes here. Would you please call the roll for the first vote, which is the motion on the notice of proposed rulemaking on electronic trading principles?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the Commission Secretary speaking. The particular motion now before the Commission is on the approval of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Electronic Trading Risk Principles. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye. Commissioner Stump.
Commissioner Stump votes aye.
Commissioner Stump votes aye. Commissioner Benham.
Commissioner Benham votes no.
Commissioner Benham votes no. Commissioner Quintens.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye. Chairman Tarbert.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 4, the noes have 1.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kirkpatrick. This is Chairman Tarbert. I'm pleased to say that the ayes have it, and the motion on the issuance of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Electronic Risk Principles is hereby approved. Are the commissioners prepared to, is there any commissioner that's not prepared to vote on the second matter? Okay. Mr. Kirkpatrick, would you please call the roll for the motion to approve the issuance of the notice withdrawing the Regulation AT proposed rule and supplemental proposal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the Commission Secretary speaking again. Now the motion before the Commission is on the issuance of the notice withdrawing the December 17th, 2015 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking and the November 25th, 2016 Supplemental Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Regulation Automated Trading. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes no.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes no. Commissioner Stump.
Commissioner Stump votes aye.
Commissioner Stump votes aye. Commissioner Benham.
Commissioner Benham votes no.
Commissioner Benham votes no. Commissioner Quintens.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye. Chairman Tarbert.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 3, the noes have 2.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kirkpatrick. The ayes have it, and the motion to issue the notice withdrawing the prior proposed rule and supplemental proposal on Regulation AT is hereby approved. At this time, we will switch to our third vote, second big topical area, which is the final rule on post-trade name give-up on swap execution facilities. From the Division of Market Oversight, we have Dorothy DeWitt once again, who's the director of the division. We also have Vince McGonigal, who is both Principal Deputy director of the Division of Enforcement and the former acting director of DMO. And then we have 3 special counsel from the Division of Market Oversight, Aleko Stamilis, Roger Smith, and Israel Goodman. With that, I will go ahead and hand over to DMO for the presentation on post-trade name give-up.
Good morning. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to present the post-trade name give-up final rule to the Commission. Before starting, I would like to introduce my colleagues who will also be present. I want to thank them before introducing them for their efforts in drafting the final rule, which we believe is well crafted to achieve the post-trade anonymity key to achieving the 2 key statutory roles of the swap execution facility, or SEF regime. 1, promoting swaps trading on SEF, and 2, promoting fair competition among the market participants, including through impartial access to SEF trading platforms. Turning to the team was led by Aleko Stamilis and includes Roger Smith, Israel Goodman, and Vince McGonigal. I would like to note that this rule contains a number of complex terms that are not found in common parlance. While the Commission speaks the language of post-trade name give-up fluently, we seek today in our presentation to provide basic context for the public. By way of background, in general, most financial exchange-like trading systems offer anonymity to the buyer and seller in order to help counterparties of all sizes and types and allow traders to enter into and exit the market without exposing their trading positions and strategies. Such trading position exposure could lead to information leakage to the detriment of one or more counterparty. As a result, markets with pre- and post-trade anonymity are generally not only fairer, but they also reflect greater liquidity provided by a more diverse set of market participants, as well as enhanced competition. In the swaps market, a number of SEFs provide for post-trade disclosure of the name of the counterparty, a practice that is known as name give-up. It can also be known as post-trade name give-up, or we may refer to it today as PTNGU. This protocol is a remnant of the pre-Dodd-Frank era, when the vast majority of swaps were traded over the counter, or OTC. In trading swaps OTC, counterparties needed to know each other's identity to manage associated credit risks. In the pre-Dodd-Frank era, very few swaps were centrally cleared. However, post-trade name give-up has continued to be required on centrally cleared swaps since, as a result of the Dodd-Frank changes, even though those central clearing houses are the counterparties to each cleared swap for each cleared swap for both parties. Given the advent of central clearing, many have appropriately questioned the continuing need for post-trade name give-up for cleared swaps. Others have gone further, criticizing this practice as anti-competitive, an obstacle to broad and diverse participation on SEFs, and potentially inconsistent with numerous provisions of the Commodity Exchange Act, sometimes we'll refer to as CEA here, and Commission regulations. Many of these parties have focused on, among other things, their fear of information leakage about if they trade their positions to be clear on SEF and to be cleared. And those concerns focus our attention on a practice that is no longer required for a large category of centrally cleared swaps. We believe this final rule that we're proposing reflects a balanced approach that is functional. My colleagues will provide the details, but in summary, the final PTNGU rule prohibits name give-up for swaps executed anonymously and intended to be cleared. However, it does not apply to swaps that are not intended to be executed anonymously, such as trades done via name disclosed request for quote. We will sometimes call that RFQ. The result also includes a limited exception for package transactions with at least one component that it is an uncleared swap or a non-swap instrument. This exception reflects current technological and operational realities that require counterparty disclosure of names for the other component of such trades that are not cleared or not swaps. In addition, the rule includes a phased implementation schedule to allow CEFs and market participants time to adjust to changes. The goal is for this rule to attract a diverse set of additional market participants who have expressed concerns regarding their avoidance of CEFs as a result of concerns of information leakage, among other things, resulting from the practice of post-trade name give-up, as well as interests in bringing liquidity and competition to CEFs once anonymity is provided. This rule provides that anonymity with limited practical exceptions, as my colleagues will explain in a few minutes. Procedurally, the Commission has undergone 2 rounds of public comments pertaining to this rulemaking. In November of 2018, the Commission issued a request for comment on post-trade name give-up. After considering public comments received in response to that request, the Commission issued a proposed rule last December. In response to the proposed rule, the Commission received comment letters from 20 different respondents, and staff participated in meetings and phone calls with various industry participants. Comments and feedback on the proposal were received from a variety of public interest and industry groups, global banks with affiliated swap dealers, non-bank market makers, asset managers, CEF operators, and third-party providers of trade processing services. Staff also consulted with the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, or SEC, and foreign regulators. Before I turn to my colleagues, I would like to thank all of the CFTC colleagues, both current and former, who worked and consulted with us on this effort within the Division of Market Oversight. I would like to thank our colleagues from outside the Division of Market Oversight right now, having already introduced the colleagues within the Division of Market Oversight. And those include within the Office of the Chief Economist, Eleni Gaskunas, Mike Pinnock, and Scott Mixon, who were integral in reviewing and analyzing the various studies and academic literature discussed in this final rule and developing the rule's cost-benefit considerations. In addition, I want to thank our colleagues from the Office of General Counsel, or OGC, Office of International Affairs, or OIA, the Division of Clearing and Risk, or DCR, and the Division of Swap Dealer and Intermediary Oversight, or DSIO, for their help with this rulemaking, as well as our colleagues from the SEC who consulted with us. Finally, I want to say thank you to the commissioners and their staff for their thoughtful and considerate feedback on this rulemaking and leading up to today's meeting. I'll now turn it over to Aleko Stamoulis to give more information.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This is Aleko Stamoulis, and this final rule before the Commission amends Part 37 of the CFTC's regulations in order to prohibit post-trade name give-up for swaps that are executed on or pursuant to the rules of a CEF and intended to be cleared. As Dorothy has explained, the term post-trade name give-up refers to the practice of disclosing the names of swap counterparties to one another after a trade is matched anonymously. The ban on post-trade name give-up applies only to execution methods that are pre-trade anonymous. Therefore, the final rule does not prohibit name disclosed trading, such as request for quote systems commonly used for dealer-to-client CEF trades. Furthermore, the post-trade name give-up will continue to be permitted for any swap that is not intended to be cleared. The final rule before the Commission today will adopt the proposed regulation with 2 notable modifications. First, the final regulation has been revised from the proposal to clarify that the ban on post-trade name give-up will apply to swaps that are prearranged or pre-negotiated anonymously, including by a participant of the CEF. Now, this modification was made at the suggestion of commenters in order to ensure that the ban will be applied in cases where, for example, a voice broker arranges or negotiates a trade anonymously and then gives up the counterparty names prior to formally entering the trade on a CEF. Therefore, the final regulation prohibits name give up for CEF trades that are executed, prearranged, or pre-negotiated on an anonymous basis and intended to be cleared. The regulation itself prohibits a CEF from directly or indirectly disclosing the identity of a counterparty to any such swap, and also requires CEFs to establish and enforce rules that prohibit any other person from doing so. The ban is thereby intended to cover anyone that might have access to counterparty names, such as CEF employees, introducing brokers, and third-party service providers. Second, the final regulation has been revised from the proposal to provide a limited exception for certain package transactions. This exception will apply if the package includes an uncleared swap or a non-swap instrument. So this exception will include U.S. Treasury swap spreads. Commenters on the proposal generally agreed that the Commission should not prohibit post-trade name give-up for uncleared swaps or non-swap instruments such as securities. However, components of a package trade are priced or quoted together as one economic transaction. So giving up the names of any component of a package would indirectly give up the name for all components of that package. And because the regulation would otherwise prohibit such indirect disclosure of counterparty names, the final regulation provides this limited exception that will permit name give up if the package includes an instrument that is not an intended to be cleared swap. Finally, with respect to implementation, the final rule provides for two separate phases of compliance, beginning with swaps that are subject to the trade execution requirement. So for swaps subject to the trade execution requirement, compliance with the final rule must begin no later than November 1st of this year. For all other swaps that are intended to be cleared, compliance must begin no later than July 5th of 2021. This concludes staff opening remarks, and at this time we are happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, this is Chairman Tarbert. Let me thank you so much to the DMO team for that outstanding presentation and your hard work on this rule. To begin the Commission's discussion and consideration of this rulemaking, I'll now entertain a motion to adopt the final rule prohibiting certain post-trade name give-up practices on swap execution facilities.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to open the floor for commissioners to ask questions and give statements. Myself, I don't have any questions for the team. We obviously introduced this proposal in the fall when I was here, and I said then, and I'll say now, that it's a fundamental principle of exchange trading systems that the buyer and seller of a given instrument, have no reason to know and do not know each other's identity. In other words, anonymity is really important. It levels the playing field for counterparties of all sizes. And I think the studies have shown that post-trade and pre-trade anonymity in our markets are generally not only fairer, but also feature greater liquidity, a more diverse set of market participants, and greater competition. And as the team said, the name give up was a vestige of the the pre-Dodd-Frank era, where people needed to know what their counterparty was for purposes of counterparty credit risk. But now that we are in a system where these trades are cleared, there's no longer a counterparty credit risk rationale. And so I'll leave it at there and just say that we've listened to comments over the last 6 months or so, and you'll see those comments reflected in this proposal. And I also want to thank all my fellow commissioners, but particularly Commissioners Benham and Berkovitz, for issuing another joint statement with me that'll be available after this meeting. And whatever time I have, I will cede to them for any further comments they'd like to make. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Commissioner Quintens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Quintens. I don't have any questions myself for the team, but I would like to thank them for their work on this proposal and the number of conversations that they've had with me and with my staff. I would also like to thank the commenters on the proposal for, I think, candidly articulating their views and their positions and giving the Commission a lot to think about in moving from the proposal to a final rule. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Benham.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief as well, and I do want to thank, again, the team for all their work, DMO, obviously specifically given their role in this, but as Dorothy pointed out, the other divisions that contributed, and the regulators, both domestic and international. Mr. Chairman, you pointed out that we'll be writing a joint concurring statement together with Mr. Berkovitz, which we did for the proposal as well, and I am appreciative of you and your team for working with my staff to get to a place where we can agree. These opportunities are rare, but I enjoy them, and I think we all strive to achieve them and get to these places as frequently as possible. So it's a good day for the three of us, certainly, and the Commission as well. And I do just want to point out, this is, I think, you talked about market structure issues and anonymity. This is a good direction a good step in the right direction for, I think, market structure, and I think the sort of compliance period will allow the CFTC to remain vigilant in terms of overseeing and monitoring these markets as they continue to evolve, as we work past Dodd-Frank and some of the new requirements of overseeing previously unregulated OTC derivatives. One quick question about package transactions, Aleko, you mentioned, and appreciating the comments that we got and the changes that were made, some quite recently. Any thoughts or concerns about sort of evasion of the prohibition and the exemption specifically to the prohibition within the context of a package transaction that may have one leg that's unclear? And if you have thought about it, are there any plans the Commission to sort of remedy them or mitigate those risks?
So thank you, Commissioner Benham. Again, in response to your first question, I will just let you know that Alex Stimoulis will be our MC, and so I'm going to turn it over to him to MC the various questions and ask that the team make sure that, given how many acronyms there are in this rule and kind of non-customary parlance words, that the team try to make sure they're explaining the various elements as they answer.
Thank you, Dorothy. This is Aleko Stimoulis, and thank you, Commissioner Benham. I think the question of evasion is an important one, and I would like to refer it to Vince McGonigal in the Division of Enforcement to address that question. So please go ahead, Vince.
Great. Thank you, Aleko. Thank you, Commissioner Benham, for the question. And I do think when I'm done, it probably makes sense to defer back over to Roger to talk just a little bit about the package framework and how we see the encouragement for facilities going forward to find ways to reach anonymity as opposed to finding ways to go away from anonymity. So within the proposed final rule, we do make reference a few times to the Commission's broad anti-evasion authority. And we do that in connection first with the commentary that Aleko mentioned in his opening statement in connection with introduced transactions. So we want to make sure that a trade that starts anonymous stays anonymous. And then we also saw and had questions concerning those circumstances where a package transaction that involved a swap, which would otherwise have applicable anonymity requirements apply, how that swap would interact with a non-anonymous, either a non-anonymous swap or a non-anonymous component that for operational legal reasons would require disclosure. And so I think Roger can fine-tune the discussion around our thinking on the processes operationally for the package. So taking those two ideas, first, we talk about that the Commission has broad anti-evasion authority, and so not only will it apply in those two instances, but it also applies into the entire rule set. And as it relates to enforcement, because we're in a situation where we would not know until the facts and circumstances of any particular activity are evaluated, which provisions may or may not apply. Sort of broadly speaking, the Commission's anti-evasion authority first is contained in Regulation 1.3, which talks about execution of transactions that would otherwise be subject to Title VII. Potentially, other anti-evasion provisions could be implicated, including, for example, interaction with clearing requirements that would pull in the anti-evasion authority under the Commodity Exchange Act, Section 287, or regulations in Part 50. We would also evaluate anti-evasion authority for any component or functionality that involved extraterritoriality transactions, and that would be Regulation 1.6. Then there are particular anti-evasion provisions that apply to swap dealers and major swap participants under Section 6E. So in the evasion framework, those are an example of some of the enforcement provisions that the market is aware of in order to make sure that they're structuring their transactions in a way that's in compliance with the Act and the regulations. Other provisions of the Commodity Exchange Act certainly could also apply, using, for example, a reference to Section 4C7, which is within the prohibited transaction section of the Commodity Exchange Act, and talks about the use of swaps to defraud. So that may be another particular area that's available. And as importantly, the exchanges have the responsibility, the swap execution facilities have the responsibility to put forward the rules, and so they'll have their own disciplinary process that's available. Sort of with that facts and circumstance framework, Commissioner, these are the types of obligations and responsibilities that we see market participants having to react to in order to make sure that they're trading in a manner that's consistent with their obligations under the Act. Aleko, can I turn it to Roger?
Sure, Vince. This is Aleko Stamoulis. I'd like to turn it back to the Commissioner just for a minute to see if we answered his question and maybe if he has a follow-up question. So please go ahead, Commissioner.
Aleko, thanks. Vince, thanks for that response. That's perfect. Exactly what I was looking for. And I guess most importantly, it's good for me to hear that you guys are obviously, as always, on top of this and thinking about how we're going to manage this particularly unique situation, I think, with the package transactions where, we have to be flexible given the uniqueness of the derivatives markets and how some of these transactions are packaged and the sort of order flow that goes through, but staying consistent with the rules, core principles, and what we're trying to accomplish. So that's all for me. If Roger would like to step in, certainly would welcome that. Otherwise, look forward to supporting this rule today. Thanks again to the team.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think given that we answered the question, we'll just go ahead and turn it back to the Chairman.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Benham and the DMO team. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any questions, but I wouldn't want that to be interpreted as an indication that advancing this rule was without a great deal of consideration for the many good questions that the public presented on this topic. I am supporting the rule. I've said it before, building an entirely new market structure is challenging, especially so for tools such as swaps where legacy markets have existed long prior to the structure we're applying today. While consideration for this legacy function is warranted, as the chair pointed out, we are today required to fill new obligations imposed by Congress to promote the trading of swaps on swap execution facilities. That is the goal that is spelled out in the statute, to promote the trading of swaps on swap execution facilities. So the debate surrounding this rule has brought to light many divergent views on how the goal is best achieved, and some unknowns relative to how the rule will impact liquidity. Not surprising, the proponents and the opponents of this rule have differing views on how this measure might impact liquidity, leaving the community of derivatives end users unable to fully ascertain whether the impact will be positive or negative. So perhaps overused, the term liquidity is nonetheless critical to the viability of the new market structure we've been tasked with helping to build. And after reading the comments, I've requested that a study be conducted as to how the changes we're making today are impacting liquidity and market access in the future. We will conduct such a study within a year of the first phase of this rule, which involves the largest set of transactions, those that are commonly known as made available to trade, and a subsequent study 24 months after all phases of implementation are complete. Only we, the CFTC, have access to the requisite data, and we must utilize it to confirm that the course we chart today is indeed contributing to the goals spelled out by Congress to promote the trading of swaps on SEF. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the team. I know this was another very challenging and complex rulemaking, and I'm very pleased to support it, and I look forward to having the results of the study once we begin to implement it.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your work on this, and very pleased to join with you and Commissioner Benham on the joint statement. And I thank all the commissioners and the staff for their work on this proposal. This is an issue that's been very important to me ever since I've joined the commission a couple years ago, and I'm tremendously pleased to see the progress that we've made recently on this. I think this is hopefully a significant improvement to transparency and principles of fair and equitable trading in our swaps market. And so I want to thank everybody who's worked on this, and my staff as well. With respect to the study that Commissioner Stump referred to, the compliance dates are independent of the results of that study. Is that correct?
Thanks for the question, Commissioner. This is Aleko Stimoulis, and that is correct. The Phase 2 compliance date, for example, is July 5th, 2021. That's entirely independent of the Commission's plans to complete the studies you're referring to.
Okay, so we have these staggered compliance dates. First date for MAT swaps made available to trade, November 1st, 2020. For the intended to be cleared swaps, the compliance date is July 5th, 2021. And so that's a 7-month difference there. Do we have any indication of whether the staggered compliance dates for the later compliance dates will be any inhibition to providing, to liquidity providers who may favor name give up, who want to continue that as long as possible, from having liquidity provided for the MAT swaps earlier? In other words, is the trading, the participation in these markets sufficiently distinct so that or integrated, so like if you're trading swaps, you've got to, for providing liquidity, you can't have some that you've got MAT, and some that you've got name give up, and some that you don't have name give up. Do we think operationally that staggered compliance dates can be done in the industry, and that it won't, having a later compliance date for some won't be an impediment to the effectiveness of the compliance date for the earlier MAT swaps?
Yes, this is Aleko Stimulus again. Thanks, Commissioner. I'll just note that we did talk to a lot of market participants, in particular CEF operators, and we talked to them about issues relating to potential challenges of implementation, and where the rule lands in terms of compliance schedule is largely informed by those types of discussions. And some of the thinking behind beginning with MAT swaps really involves the idea that MAT swaps are the methods of execution are limited. For example, Part 37 requires CEFs to limit the methods of execution for those swaps to either an order book or an RFQ to 3. What we would note is once you include other intended to be cleared swaps, CEFs can offer a variety of other execution methods. And so in terms of implementation, after talking to CEF operators, we thought it made sense to start with MAT swaps insofar as the implementation would be simpler. And there may be more challenges involved with other types of swaps, which is why we decided to delay the implementation schedule into a phase 2 and provide more time for CEFs to sort of operationally figure out how they're going to comply.
So your conversations with the CEFs lead to you believe that this is practically this is without whether it's exactly this number of months or that number of months, but essentially this type of staggered compliance date structure makes sense from the CEF operator's perspective in terms of operationalizing how we make the transition. That's what I gather you're saying.
Yes, Commissioner, that was an important part of the consideration of sort of spreading it out. And I will notice, the comment letters did reflect some of the same concerns about operationally. In particular, there are some concerns expressed on the record by CEFs and also in other conversations we had with CEFs regarding voluntarily cleared swaps and that they may need to sort of change some of their processes in order to be able to comply with the rule. And really the message that we got was for other types of swaps, it may take longer for MAT swaps and swaps that are sort of required to be cleared. It may be a little bit easier, and so that does reflect some of the challenges for non-MAT swaps with implementation, insofar as sort of stretching that out into a second phase.
And we're very highly dependent upon a few dealers for a lot of liquidity. And it's good that the dealers are providing that liquidity. And I don't want to discourage dealers from providing liquidity. That's very important, and they're a critical part of the market. But to have the markets so reliant upon so few dealers is a systemic risk issue, as well as a competitiveness issue. And so removing this regulatory barrier is to more greater competition, in my view, is important. But obviously removing regulatory barriers is not the only thing. Somebody's got to provide the liquidity that be those additional sources of liquidity that we're removing barriers to. Removing a barrier to an additional source of liquidity doesn't mean that liquidity will appear. But one is it makes it harder to do name give up in certain markets, and two is it may provide further incentive. And I've talked to a lot of entities who have been interested in providing liquidity in these markets. And so maybe with the structural change, they're the ones who are going to have to put up significant investments and resources into providing that liquidity. But perhaps with this change, more of those people will be willing to put up that liquidity, even, and it won't be so dependent on totally whether the dealers to decide to do it or not. So recognizing, the package transaction exception, we'll see indeed how that goes. But removing this regulatory barrier is a significant step forward, and I look forward to continuing to watch these markets to see how they develop. And the study that we conduct, we can evaluate this issue in that as well, perhaps. So anyway, thank you, staff for your work on this, Dorothy, Lecco, Roger, Vince, and Israel. This was an excellent endeavor. And thank you, Sebastian, on my staff, too.
So this is Dorothy. May I just pause for a second to let the technical folks on the call know that there was an issue, but I just got a ping that issue's been resolved. So we can go ahead and carry on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I guess, Commissioner Berkovitz, are you finished your question time?
Yes, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just wanted to step in to say that my understanding is, this is Chairman Tarbert, that there was a temporary glitch that put the public access to our discussion, the public meeting line, down for a short period. I'm not certain for how long, but it may have just been a matter of minutes. I just want to confirm if the operator is on the line, that the public line is open.
Yes, this is the operator. We were down for about a minute and a half. Public line is open. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then could I also just check then to make sure all 5 members of the commission are present, before others, including myself. Commissioner Quintens?
Yes, this is Commissioner Quintens. I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Benham?
Yes, present. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Stump?
Yes, I'm present. Thank you.
And we'll make sure we didn't lose you, Commissioner Berkovitz. Still on?
Yes, I'm still on now. I had actually dropped off for maybe half a minute during your statement, but then I got back on, so thank you.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you, everybody. I think based on us wrapping up our discussion, I'll now ask the question, is there any commissioner not prepared to vote? Okay, Mr. Kirkpatrick, would you please call the roll for the final rule on post-trade name give-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the Commission Secretary. The motion now before the Commission is on the adoption of the final rule prohibiting certain post-trade name give-up practices on swap execution facilities. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye. Commissioner Stump.
Commissioner Stump votes aye.
Commissioner Stump votes aye. Commissioner Benham.
Commissioner Benham votes aye.
Commissioner Benham votes aye. Commissioner Quintens.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye. Chairman Tarbert.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 5, the noes have 0.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kirkpatrick. I am pleased to say that the ayes have it, and the motion to adopt the final rule is approved unanimously. Before we move to our next agenda item, I wanted to briefly make an announcement regarding the final rules on covered funds on the Volcker rule. We voted that matter in seriatim. The final rule was passed by a vote of 3-2. Myself, Commissioner Quintens, and Commissioner Stump voting in the affirmative, and Commissioners Benham and Berkovitz voting in the negative. There are 3, the press release, along with 3 statements, one by myself as well as ones by Commissioner Benham and Berkovitz, have been posted to the website or will be posted shortly. So with that, we move to our next agenda item. And so I would like to welcome the following staff for their presentation on the final rule on alternative compliance for anti-evasionary provisions of the inter-affiliate swap clearing exemption. From the Division of Clearing and Risk, we have Clark Hutchison, the Director, Sarah Josephson, Deputy Director, Melissa Darcy, Special Counsel. With that, I will hand it over to you, Clark, Sarah, and Melissa, for your presentation.
Thank you. As Chairman Tarbert mentioned, I am Clark Hutchison, the Director of Clearing and Risk. During these isolated times, on behalf of everyone in the Division of Clearing and Risk, we wish you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, and fellow staff, warm greetings and a hearty good afternoon. My staff and I will now be presenting a final rule that will amend Commission Regulation 50.52, the inter-affiliate exemption from the Commission's swap clearing requirement. When the Commission adopted the inter-affiliate exemption, it established conditions that affiliates must satisfy when electing the inter-affiliate exemption in relation to cross-border swaps activity. The alternative compliance provisions were time-limited and expired in 2014. Since that date, the Division of Clearing and Risk staff have provided targeted relief to allow eligible affiliates to continue using the expired compliance frameworks. Today's amendments will reinstate the alternative compliance provisions with minor modifications to align with the staff no-action relief that is currently in place. I would like to recognize Sarah Josephson, a Deputy Director, and Melissa Darcy, a Special Counsel from the Division of Clearing and Risk, for their work on this rulemaking. In addition, I would like to thank our colleagues in the Office of the General Counsel, Carlene Kim, Paul Schlichting, and Mark Pfeiffer, and our colleagues in the Office of the Chief Economist, Scott Mixon and Stephen Kane, for their time, effort, and helpful assistance in preparing this rulemaking. Thank you all again. I will now ask Melissa Darcy to introduce the final rule to the Commission, which they'll be considering this afternoon. Thank you. And over to you, Melissa, please.
Great. Thank you, Clark. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. As Clark said, my name is Melissa Darcy. I'm a Special Counsel in the Division of Clearing and Risk, and I will be outlining the key changes under consideration in this final rule. Today, staff recommends that the Commission adopt the final rule to amend Commission Regulation 50.52. These amendments would codify current market practices under the terms of staff no-action relief relating to certain conditions to the inter-affiliate exemption from the swap clearing requirement. As background, in 2013, soon after the Commission issued its first clearing requirement for certain interest rate and credit default swaps, the Commission adopted an inter-affiliate exemption. The Commission determined that inter-affiliate swaps provide an important risk management role within corporate groups, and that such swaps, if properly risk managed, may be beneficial to the entity as a whole. The Commission recognized these benefits and adopted the exemption subject to certain conditions that require eligible affiliates to manage the risks associated with the exempt swaps through a centralized risk management program and to report certain information to a swap data repository. A third tailored condition, the outward-facing swaps condition, is the focus of this final rule today. The outward-facing swaps condition is intended to address the risk that affiliated entities evade the Commission's clearing requirement through third-party trades with foreign affiliates that are not subject to a domestic clearing regime. In the absence of broadly similar clearing requirements around the globe, eligible affiliates could enter into uncleared swaps with an unaffiliated counterparty outside of the U.S. and then enter into uncleared swaps on a back-to-back basis using this inter-affiliate exemption to transfer risk back into the United States. Ideally, outward-facing swaps would be cleared by a derivatives clearing organization cleared under a comparable foreign clearing regime or qualify for an appropriate exemption from mandatory clearing. However, in 2013, the Commission recognized that non-U.S. regimes were not being implemented quickly enough for this option to be viable. So the Commission adopted a set of time-limited alternative compliance frameworks whereby affiliated entities can pay variation margin on their swaps as a means of limiting the possibility of evading the U.S. clearing requirement and transferring risk into the United States. Currently, market participants continue to rely on the variation margin provisions of these alternative compliance frameworks pursuant to staff no-action letters. This final rule reinstates the alternative compliance frameworks as part of the Commission's regulations. The final rule also includes an expanded list of jurisdictions in which an eligible affiliate may be located and still take advantage of an alternative compliance framework without being subject to a 5% limit. The Commission originally adopted an alternative compliance framework that had no limits on the number or percentage of inter-affiliate swaps that could be executed with an affiliate located in the European Union, Japan, or Singapore, so long as the variation margin requirement was satisfied. In 2016, after the original swap clearing requirement and inter-affiliate exemption had been in place for a few years, the Commission expanded its interest rate swap clearing requirement to cover additional currencies. CCR anticipated that affiliates would enter into more swaps in jurisdictions within which the official domestic currency was subject to the Commission's clearing requirements. As a result, the Division of Clearing and Risk issued no action relief to permit affiliates to elect to comply with the alternative compliance frameworks for entities in an expanded list of jurisdictions, including Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, Mexico, and Switzerland. The staff no action relief limited the amount of uncleared inter-affiliate swaps that an eligible affiliate counterparty located in the United States may enter into with affiliates in any jurisdiction other than the identified jurisdiction, to not more than 5% of the aggregate notional value of all of its swaps, which are subject to the Commission's clearing requirement. This limitation is intended to prevent concentrations of uncleared inter-affiliate swaps risk from building up at entities in jurisdictions that do not have established clearing regimes. The final rule codifies this approach. Finally, the rule eliminates certain provisions that have not been relied upon by market participants and are thus unnecessary. These eliminations include a provision related to non-financial entities and the option to variation margin swaps entered into with unaffiliated counterparties. All of the amendments outlined today were discussed in a notice of proposed rulemaking and published for public comment on December 23, 2019. The comment period closed on February 21, 2020. The Commission received one comment letter in response to its proposal from the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. This comment letter was broadly supportive of the proposal because it provides legal certainty to market participants operating under Commission staff no action relief. In addition, staff continues to monitor transaction-level swap data to understand the types of entities that are electing the inter-affiliate exemption and how those entities are complying with the outward-facing swaps conditions. I would like to thank all of the various Commission staff who provided helpful edits and revisions to improve the draft, and I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon. This concludes our opening remarks, and we would be glad to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Clark, Sarah, and Melissa, for that great presentation. To begin the Commission's discussion and consideration of this rulemaking, I'll now entertain a motion to adopt the final rule exempting certain affiliated entities from the swap clearing requirement.
So moved.
Second. Thank you. I'll now open the floor for commissioners to give statements and ask questions. I'll go ahead and begin, and I don't have any questions for the team, but I think if one were new to this area and watching, perhaps listening to this meeting, I think people might be scratching their heads and saying, what is this all about? This seems pretty technical and complicated. Bottom line here is, we've got a couple of things going on. We have our clearing requirement, which basically was a measure to ensure that counterparty credit risk is at least traditional counterparty credit risk is basically taken off the table, that certain swaps are liquid enough and standardized enough that they can go through central counterparties, clearinghouses, or what we technically refer to as DCOs, derivative clearing organizations, whereas other swaps that don't meet that criteria are not cleared. And so at the same time, we recognize that when you have a corporate group, the same company basically, but with a bunch of different entities inside of that company, we don't necessarily treat those transactions, if they are counterparties to swaps among each other, as the same as what we do when we're dealing with truly arm's length counterparties. So in other words, think about it, the way I like to think about it is, we wouldn't expect the government to regulate loans between members of your immediate family, you and your immediate family, in the same way that we would, an arm's length transaction between someone who's unrelated. And so we've obviously exempted from the clearing requirement certain inter-affiliate transactions where you've got members of the same corporate family. Problem, of course, is that it potentially opens the door for evasion of the clearing requirement, because then corporation says, I'd have to clear this swap if I'm doing it with this counterparty. But you know what? If I find a member of my corporate family that's from a jurisdiction that doesn't have a clearing requirement, I'll just basically slip them in the middle. And so we're concerned about that. So we have this sort of what I'd call limitations to the exception. And in some cases, we require mandatory clearing, but what we've also decided to do as an alternative is to at least require variation margin. So there is some margining there, not to perhaps the same extent as a clearinghouse with the initial and variation margin, but nonetheless, we're treating those transactions a little bit differently because but for that counterparty as part of the corporate family being in the middle there, it would have had to have been centrally cleared. So that's the big picture here, I think, of what we're trying to do. And as the team so well articulated, there's a few more wrinkles other than beyond that, just to make sure that, again, this I think needed exception for inter-affiliates is not going to be used to undermine the overall goal of ensuring that certain classes of swaps are in fact centrally cleared. So no questions on my end. Really appreciate the level of staff involvement as well as the technical expertise that was needed to make this workable. With that, I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Commissioner Quintens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Quintens. I just have two quick questions. And first of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your explanation of this rule. I think for those that aren't familiar with the CFTC or our markets, or even that do have some familiarity with our market, this is a very complicated issue to understand, and it relates to ensuring that we're not inserting ourselves into the inner transactions of a particular business unnecessarily and forcing it to use up its liquidity for those purposes. But also, I think, as you explained, to ensure that our rules are preserved and they have integrity. So to my questions, I think I'm not sure who the best person would be to answer this, but obviously this is based off of the clearing requirement the CFTC has put in place, and it recognizes 9 foreign jurisdictions. And I just wanted to ask, what is the thinking about issuing comparability determinations generally for other jurisdictions' clearing requirements?
Yes, this is Melissa Darcy speaking again. Thank you, Commissioner Quintens, for that request. I can explain the staff's view of the comparability between the CFTC's clearing requirement and other jurisdictions' clearing regimes, and why it may be impractical at this time to look for a comparability determination. The Commission has not considered or adopted a comparability determination with respect to the CFTC's swap clearing requirement because there are significant differences in the scope of products that are required to be cleared and the types of market participants that are required to clear across jurisdictions. For example, although a number of other jurisdictions have adopted mandatory clearing regimes that cover interest rate swaps, no other country has the same set of products that are required to be cleared as the CFTC. Across jurisdictions, the set of swaps subject to mandatory clearing often vary with respect to the currencies that are covered, the floating indexes referenced, and the termination date ranges that are subject to the clearing mandates. In addition to these product differences, each clearing regime has a unique approach to the types of market participants that are required to clear the swaps. Some jurisdictions have a broad application of the clearing requirement with specific exceptions and exemptions, like the CFTC, but even here, sometimes those exceptions and exemptions do not align. Other jurisdictions have a more limited application of the clearing requirement to specific counterparties, and in those jurisdictions, a smaller number of market participants are covered than those covered by the CFTC's clearing requirement. The CFTC's clearing requirement is unique, and it would be difficult to make a determination that another jurisdiction is consistent with the CFTC's with respect to both products and the participants covered.
Thank you very much. I think while we haven't issued comparability determinations for those jurisdictions that have adopted the swap clearing requirements, this rule does, in some degree, recognize those regimes by, I guess, placing a limitation on affiliates' variation margining of their swaps when the affiliate is located outside of one of those jurisdictions. Specifically, there's a 5% limitation on affiliates' variation margining of their swaps regarding the outward facing swaps condition. But I was just hoping if someone could explain to me the rationale for that 5% limitation.
Yes, thank you. This is Melissa Darcy again. Staff believes that the 5% limitation you mentioned, which applies to the aggregate notional value of swaps covered by the CFTC's clearing requirement with an eligible affiliate counterparty located outside of one of those 9 jurisdictions listed or the United States, is a generally useful tool to prevent excessive uncleared swap risk from concentrating in an affiliate located in a jurisdiction without an established clearing regime. So this 5% test is intended to prevent those non-U.S. affiliates from taking on unlimited uncleared swap risk in the categories of swaps that are subject to the CFTC's clearing requirement, which can then flow back to the United States through an affiliated entity. Again, the test applies only to the swaps covered by our clearing requirement, which would otherwise have to be cleared if the affiliates did not qualify for an exemption. Although the final rule does not require the eligible affiliate counterparties to pay and collect full variation margin daily with all eligible affiliate counterparties, it is staff's belief that this 5% test acts as an additional layer of risk protection by essentially capping the exposure of the U.S. affiliate to certain types of uncleared swaps in jurisdictions where it's less likely that the swaps will be cleared.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions I have. I do have a statement in support of the final rule today, but in the interest of time, let me just thank the staff again for their work on this important issue in bringing a final rule to a vote, and I'm fully supportive of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Benham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any questions because they've been addressed, at least in part. So I won't have anything formal to go back and forth with the staff. But first off, I want to thank the staff, specifically Melissa Darcy, Sarah Joseph, and of course Clark, all out of DCR for your leadership on this and working with my staff. I will have a statement that will be on the website shortly that the public can view if they choose. And I would also just like to say that I'm really pleased to be supporting this because in addition to, I think, it being the right policy decision, it's also another example of this current commission and the previous commission under Chairman John Carlos' leadership of tidying up a lot of no-action relief that was issued shortly after Dodd-Frank and ensuring and providing market certainty for our market participants and the folks who work within our market. So pleased to be supporting this. I just do want to note one particular issue, and the reason I'm not going to ask a question is because we've talked about outward-facing swaps a number of times. I raised this issue in a statement after we proposed the rule back in 2019 and some of the risks that may be presented with the outward-facing swaps. Melissa obviously discussed those in her presentation, obviously talking about the variation margin requirement, but also the CFTC's ability to review and examine and surveil transaction-level data so that we sort of remain vigilant for our responsibilities, the clearing requirement at large, but also being flexible with our registrants and market participants so that we're not unduly imposing requirements where it's not required. Mr. Chairman, I appreciated your explanation. I think to Commissioner Quintens' point, these are complicated issues, and it's always helpful to explain these matters the best that we can to the public so that they can have a better understanding of what we do and what the CFTC does on a day-to-day basis. But certainly, as much as we want to remain flexible for these unique circumstances, and I'm not suggesting that we're not doing this. You said this yourself, Mr. Chairman, that we have to remain vigilant with unique circumstances because, whether it's a corporate family affiliate or sub overseas
Commissioner Benham, I believe we've lost you.
2008, one way or another. So, again, grateful to DCR for all their work. I'm glad that we're going to provide this exemption and codify no action relief that's been out for a while remaining, again, vigilant on individuals or entities that may try to evade this requirement so that we don't present and introduce new risk unnecessarily into the market. Thank you again. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Benham. You blacked out for a quick moment regarding your comment to 2008. Do you want to just take a moment to say that again? It was just in the last minute or so.
Sure. Sorry about that. My phone's been acting up, but I just wanted to make the point that you alluded to, that we need to be flexible with respect to corporate groups in many circumstances, but we should never sort of fail to recall and remember that these types of transactions often have created risks and systemic in 2008 risks that have been brought to the market. So we have to remain vigilant, which I appreciate that the Commission has committed to doing. So thanks to you and DCR for that commitment and continued vigilance.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also have no questions. I just want to take the opportunity to make a brief statement regarding my general support for efforts to codify longstanding no-action relief that has proven to be worthwhile, such as that we're considering today. I think the staff often has an occasion to issue relief or take other actions, such as no-action relief, interpretive letters, advisories on various issues and in various circumstances. This affords the Commission a chance to observe how the staff action operates in real time and to evaluate the lessons we're learning. As I previously noted, with the benefit of this time and experience, the Commission should then consider whether codifying such staff actions into rules is appropriate in order to provide the legal certainty that the marketplace requires. I am hopeful that we can continue to clean up our rule book in such a pragmatic way, such as we are doing today, and I know there are a number of things that are candidates for codification, and I look forward to considering them. I do want to thank the team specifically today from DCR for their efforts to help us tidying up the rule book, and I look forward to other opportunities to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Berkovitz. So I too want to state my support for this final rule and thank everybody who's worked on it. I view this rule for many of the reasons that have been stated really as doing a couple things. One is help protect against risk being imported back into the U.S. And as you explained, Mr. Chairman, this deals with the potential that a U.S. entity and its non-U.S. affiliate enter into swaps. And as is traditional practice, the non-U.S. affiliate may want to enter into a swap with another non-U.S. entity, and then perhaps the U.S. entity is the ultimate place where that risk lies, and so they will then back-to-back that swap back into the U.S. So effectively the risk from the non-U.S. affiliate and the non-U.S. counterparty is imported back into the U.S. Well, one could take the position that the swaps between the U.S. entity and its non-U.S. affiliate have to be cleared, but that poses the issues of, as you've described, that making two entities within the same corporate structure clear. Initially, when the Commission addressed this issue back in 2012 or 13 era, I forget when the initial rule was adopted, the provision to ensure that these risks from non-U.S. affiliate swaps didn't get imported back into the U.S., there was the provision that allowed effectively what we're allowing today, this exchange of variation margin. At that time, it was anticipated that in a few years, we would have these comparability determinations, and therefore, if you want to do these swaps, if affiliates want to do the swaps, then the condition would be that the non-U.S. affiliate would be subject to the comparable clearing requirement with a non-U.S. counterparty, so that effectively you couldn't evade the U.S. clearing requirement by doing a back-to-back with a foreign affiliate. So that was really an anti-evasionary motivation, and as well as to ensure that risk didn't get imported back into the U.S. Well, as things turned out, the anticipation that there would be all these clearing determinations with non-U.S. jurisdictions, for the reason I think that Sarah explained, didn't come about. We just haven't made those comparability determinations. So the rule gave a few years, said this alternative compliance framework where the exchange variation margin would expire in a few years, and by then we'll have these clearing determinations. Well, we didn't get the clearing determinations. The rule expired. So what we did was we granted, the staff granted no action relief to continue the ability to exchange variation margin. And that's happened. We've extended it several times. And so here we are today with several extensions. And that framework has appeared to have worked. That the exchange of variation margin prevents these back-to-back swaps from importing risk back into the U.S. There's risk management practices. The company and its affiliate have to engage in risk management practices and exchange variation margin. So we have over time, although the initial regulation provision expired, we have over time found that original approach has worked. And as Commissioner Stump noted, so based on that experience, we're able to go final. So I view this as a measure to help prevent risk from being imported to the U.S. It's an anti-evasionary measure, and it also is another measure where through no action relief, temporary time-limited no action relief, we have observed how the market has responded and grown comfortable with that response and that practice, are unable to codify it. So no action letters sometimes get criticized for why do we do them? Why don't we just do regulations, et cetera? But this is a good example how market practice permitted by a no action letter over the span of a sufficient amount of time, a few years and extensions. We can see how the industry is implementing it and whether it's needed or not, and make the determination of whether to put it into regulation. So I think both in terms of what the substance of this rule gets at and the process by which we've obtained the confidence to put it in rule text, is all that's positive. And so I'm pleased to support the rule and thank the staff for their work on it.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Berkovitz. Well, I think that brings to a close our question and answer time. Is there any commissioner who is not prepared to vote? Okay, hearing none. Mr. Kirkpatrick, could I please call on you to call the roll for the final rule on the inter-affiliate swap clearing exemption?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the Commission Secretary speaking. The motion now before the Commission is on the adoption of the final rule exempting certain affiliated entities from the swap clearing requirement. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye. Commissioner Stump.
Commissioner Stump votes aye.
Commissioner Stump votes aye. Commissioner Benham.
Commissioner Benham votes aye.
Commissioner Benham votes aye. Commissioner Quintens.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye. Chairman Tarbert.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 5, the noes have 0.
This is Chairman Tarbert. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. I'm pleased to announce that the ayes have it and the final rule is adopted unanimously. Now we move to our final agenda item for purposes of a vote, and that is the proposed rule extending the Phase 6 compliance date for initial margin requirements for uncleared swaps and for swap dealers and major swap participants. And of course, we mentioned this last time in our open meeting that this is related to COVID-19 and what the international community has already proposed to do. So in furtherance of that, I'd like to invite a staff presentation on this topic. From the Division of Swap Dealer and Intermediary Oversight, we have Josh Sterling, our Director, Warren Gorlick, the Associate Director, Carmen Moncada-Terry, Special Counsel, and I'd be remiss if I didn't also personally thank Eric Remler from Commissioner Berkowitz's office for his help on this proposal. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Josh, Warren, and Carmen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Director Josh Sterling for the division. Good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to the rest of the commission. I know it's been a long meeting, and we will move apace. I want to begin, though, by thanking Mr. Remler as well for really some great work in supporting us during a very busy period. I'll simply observe to begin that as you all know, my division is deadly focused on smart, effective, and practical oversight of our registrants. We were here together a few weeks ago before you, extending Phase 5 in light of the pandemic, the margin requirements for Phase 5 by means of an interim final rule, and we are back here following good order and seeking to propose that Phase 6 be extended for a year as well. And as the chairman has noted, this will align us with the international community and what we expect will be the approach ultimately taken by our fellow U.S. federal financial regulators. With that, I will hand over to my team, who is well-traveled in this area, as you all know, Warren and Carmen, to thank others who've supported the work on this rule and to make the presentation. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Josh. So good afternoon. This is, in fact, Warren Gorlick. I'm the Associate Director in the Division of Swap Dealer and Intermediary Oversight. And in addition to Josh, who just introduced our presentation, I am joined by my colleague, Carmen Moncada-Terry, Special Counsel. As all have already recognized, we want to note the invaluable assistance we received from Eric Remler, and we would also note the great assistance we received from the Office of General Counsel and the Office of the Chief Economist. Today, we are pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking to amend the CFTC margin rule by delaying for certain entities the September 1, 2021 deadline for compliance with the initial margin requirements and delay that to September 1, 2022. By way of background, the CFTC margin rule that became effective in 2016 requires that swap dealers and MSPs post and collect initial margin in accordance with the compliance schedule set forth in Commission Regulation 23.161. As adopted in 2016, the schedule required compliance on staggered compliance dates spanning from September 2016 to September 2020. The CFTC margin schedule was consistent with the implementation schedule set forth in the Basel Committee and IOSCO's framework for margin requirements for uncleared derivatives. Last year, the Basel Committee and IOSCO revised the framework to extend the implementation schedule to September 2021. On April 9, 2020, consistent with the revision to the Basel Committee IOSCO framework, the CFTC published in the Federal Register a final rule that we refer to in the NPRM and today as the April 2020 final rule that amended the compliance schedule for the initial margin requirements under the CFTC margin rule by splitting the last phase of compliance that began on September 1, 2020 into two compliance phases that would begin partly on September 1, 2020 and partly on September 1, 2021. The April 2020 final rule effectively extended by 1 year the compliance date for entities with smaller average daily aggregate notional amounts of swaps and certain other financial products. In the NPRM, we refer to this as the smaller portfolio group. The Commission's intent in adopting the April 2020 final rule was to mitigate the potential for market disruption that could have resulted from the large number of entities that would have into initial margin compliance at the end of the phased compliance schedule beginning on September 2020. The entities would have needed to engage at the same time a limited number of financial services providers to arrange for the exchange of regulatory IM, including the preparation of compliant documentation, the approval and implementation of risk-based models for IM calculation, and the setup of custodial arrangements. In April 2020, in recognition of the operational challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Basel Committee and IOSCO announced the further extension of the implementation schedule for 1 year by deferring the deadlines of September 2020 and September 2021 to September 2021 and September 22, respectively. That is to say, a 1 year delay for each. Consistent with the Basel Committee's and IOSCO's revision of the implementation schedule, last month, on May 28, 2020, the Commission adopted an interim final rule extending the September 2020 compliance date for entities subject to that compliance date, and we refer to this as the IFR extension group, to September 1, 2021, in order to alleviate the immediate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on such entities. This IFR did not extend the compliance deadline, however, for entities beginning compliance on September 1, 2021, as the impact of the pandemic on these entities was unclear. As a result of the IFR extension group and the smaller portfolio group would be required to begin initial margin compliance on the same day, which could lead to the potential for market disruption that the April 2020 final rule was intended to address. Staff therefore recommends that the Commission publish for comment this proposed rulemaking, which would extend the smaller portfolio group's compliance deadline of September 2021 to September 2022. The extension of this deadline is consistent with the Basel Committee and IOSCO's guidance and would achieve the intent of the April 2020 final rule, which sought to reduce the potential for market disruption that could result from a large number of entities coming into compliance with the initial margin requirements at the same time. So thank you for your attention after a long meeting. We'd be happy to discuss any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. This is Chairman Tarbert. That was an excellent presentation. And again, Josh, Warren, and Carmen, great job getting this ready in short order. To begin the Commission's discussion and consideration of this proposed rulemaking, I'll now entertain a motion to approve the proposed rule extending the Phase 6 compliance date.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you very much. So now I'd like to open up the floor for commissioners to ask any questions and give any statements they might have. I've discussed these extensions for both verbally and in my written statement last meeting. So I'll go ahead and forego any questions or comments now and move straight to Commissioner Quintens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm pretty much in the same boat. I think we've discussed this at length, and I certainly have discussed my views on it at the prior meeting and times before that. And so let me first thank the staff for their work on this and putting this before us in, I think, fairly short order. A very impressive job. But this also just gives me an opportunity, Mr. Chairman, if I may, to recognize the work of the Office of Chief Economist, and in particular Bruce Tuckman. A lot of the issues around the number of counterparties involved in Phase 5, at then Phase 5, and now Phase 5 and Phase 6, in addition to the small notional values and amount of margin in question, we're really brought to light by work that Bruce Tuckman and his staff at OCE put together. And I just wanted to thank Bruce for his tireless work. It's just been a pleasure to work with him at the Commission over the last 2 years, and I'm very grateful for his service in that role. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Benham.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. No questions for me. I do want to thank DSIO staff for putting this together, as was noted, work from Commissioner Berkman's office. I have a statement that I will publish supporting this proposal, and I think within the context of Phase 5 and Phase 6 and what we've been dealing with, I think globally as a consequence of the pandemic, Phase 6, I'm interested to see what the comments are coming back. Obviously, uncleared margin requirements have been many years in the making. It's been quite remarkable to see our industry respond to the pandemic from a technological standpoint, from a business standpoint, and of course from a personal standpoint. Given the fact that many have responded in a wonderful way, transitioning business, keeping markets orderly and safe and functional. Given Phase 6 being out to 2021 and then potentially 2022, it'll just be interesting to see what the comments are, whether or not all market participants share the view that Phase 6 should be open to it, of course, if it's Phase 6, but hearing the responses, I think, will better inform the Commission and regulators and policymakers as to the best decision forward. So thanks again to DSIO staff for your work, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to support today's proposed rule to achieve the globally agreed to extension. I've had the opportunity to work with Warren and Carmen recently on this matter and various initiatives that the agency has been involved in, and I very much appreciate their time and attention to this matter. It's very important to me as well, and I look forward to hearing the public's views on this extension that is related to the COVID pandemic, but I also hope that the Commission will soon consider addressing a number of recommendations included in the report that was recently prepared by the Subcommittee on Margin Requirements for Non-Cleared Swaps and adopted recently by the Global Markets Advisory Committee. That subcommittee's charge was different. It was not pandemic related, and the issues discussed in the report remain despite this the one-year extension in compliance dates that are before us today. So I look forward to having input on both the proposal to extend as well as the report addressing some specific items that make these last two phases particularly challenging for specific market participants implicated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I'd also like to thank Eric Remler on my staff for stepping up and helping to draft this rule and working with DSIO and their on this significant effort by Eric, and I appreciate it. My concern on this, I support the proposal. We just did an extension, a one-year extension, and this extension is now, and partially we did that extension to avoid the crunch that would come from both Phase 5 and this Phase 6, all being at the same time. So we extended this originally from September of this year into September of next year to avoid that crunch that would have otherwise happened at September of this year. And now this is necessitated by the fact that we're extending Phase 5 for a year, and it's not just us. This is done on a global basis. So we're avoiding another crunch, supposedly, although everybody will have had another year, albeit a COVID interrupted year. do this, but we keep pushing these off, and whether all these entities need till September 2022 to do this, I'm not convinced. Some extent, if everybody else in the world is doing it, that's a significant consideration, whether we would be setting up a separate timeline for the entities that we're responsible for. Perhaps, I don't know that would be infeasible, but anyway, I look forward to the public comments on it. I'm supporting the proposal, but yet another full year after we just granted a year does seem like a long time, and considering they've had a number of years prior to this to get ready for it. So voting for the proposal, look forward to comment, not yet convinced that yet another full year beyond 2021 into 2022 is necessary. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks everybody for working on this rule together.
Thank you, Commissioner Berkovitz. Is there any commissioner not prepared to vote? Okay, then I'll please ask our Secretary, Mr. Kirkpatrick, to please call the roll for the proposed rule extending the Phase 6 deadline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the Commission Secretary. The motion now before the Commission is on the approval of the proposed rule extending the Phase 6 compliance date. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye. Commissioner Stump.
Commissioner Stump votes aye.
Commissioner Stump votes aye. Commissioner Benham.
Commissioner Benham votes aye.
Commissioner Benham votes aye. Commissioner Quintens.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye. Chairman Tarbert.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 5, the noes have 0.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. This is Chairman Tarbert. I'm pleased to say that the ayes have it, and the motion on the proposed rule is hereby approved unanimously. Before we move to closing statements, is there any other commission business from my colleagues? Okay, hearing none, the only thing I would like to say is just a quick announcement to let everyone know that we'll be making the audio recording and transcript of this meeting, available as soon as possible. And to the extent any portions of the meeting were not captured by the audio recording, we'll provide a summary of that portion of the meeting. We'll go ahead and begin with any final statements or comments, at this time in reverse order of seniority. So we'll start with you, Commissioner Berkovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I've made my sufficient statements on each of the proposals, so I won't go into the proposals. I just again want to thank everybody who's worked on these rules. Again, I've said this before, the 5-0 vote belies the difficulty in getting all there. And even on non-5-0 votes, there's still very difficult issues and a lot of back and forth with all the commissioners. And I appreciate my colleagues' efforts in that to have a dialogue and the give and take of the process. At the end of the day, we agree on certain things and we disagree on certain things. But we do it in a collegial manner, and we come together on a number of things, and I really enjoy that, and the staff has been helpful to me and my staff, regardless of particular viewpoints that may be expressed, agreement or disagreement with a draft here or there. A lot of work into incorporating comments, a lot of drafts over many days, and into the evenings and on the weekends. And certainly one thing about working remotely that's been apparent is as it was even before we were working remotely, but I think it's more so now that the blurring of work and home is almost no more blurring. It's almost indistinct between There's no more going into the office. We're continually living in the office. And the CFTC and its staff and the dedication, people working nights, weekends, all around the clock to provide drafts and comment and information back and forth has really been remarkable through this whole exercise, more than an exercise, through this whole effort that we're undertaking of working in a socially distanced remote environment. So yes, we're at home, but to tell you the truth, our home is our work and our work is our home. So I want to thank everybody for all the effort. And I know it's on my staff. This is required around the clock work and effort and attention, and we all have many family responsibilities at the same time. So I just want to express appreciation to my staff for Eric and Sebastian and Lucy. Sebastian, really, a number of these rules were in his domain for this meeting, and it did require around the clock work because you've got to deal with everybody's work habits. Some people work late at night, some people get up early in the morning. And if you're in between, you're working both late at night and early in the morning. So thank you all, and have a hope folks can enjoy the 4th of July holiday coming up.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Berkovitz. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I could say it any better than Commissioner Berkovitz, so I'm just going to ask that I be associated with everything he said. I would like to thank my team specifically, though, Libby Master-Giacomo, Dan Buxted, Terry Arbert, and Charlie Ladd for their help this week and the weeks leading up to this week. It's been very busy, and I very much appreciate their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Benham.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. First, special thanks to my staff, John Dumpy, Laura Guardian, David Gillers for their work leading up to today's meeting, and appreciate time and commitment from all the staff during this trying time. So I hope everyone is doing well, staying safe, the public as well, and look forward to continued meetings. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing up these important rules. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Quintens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Quintens. I don't have a formal statement. I would like to join the other commissioners in thanking all the staff from the agency today that worked hard to present these proposed and final rules before us, as well as thanking my own staff. I mentioned Kevin Webb and his extraordinary work on the risk principles for electronic trading. I'd also like to recognize Margot Bailey from my staff for her work on the post-trade name give up and the Phase 6, and Peter Calls for his work on the inter-affiliate margin. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yet another open meeting in the environment in which we find ourselves. I think the dedication to conducting our business in public, whether or not it's in person or over the phone, is a testament to you, but also to the camaraderie that we have amongst the commissioners, and to elevate the discourse to policy differences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Quintens. Let me echo everything that everyone has said. Of course, let me thank all of your staffs and the chairman, the commissioner's offices, my own staff, particularly Andrew Ridenauer and Chelsea Pizzola and Matt Degler, who worked on the rulemakings that we voted on today, and also those we voted on yesterday. Let me also thank all of the members of our staff, including the Office of General Counsel and the Office of Chief Economist. To pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, Commissioner Quintens, Bruce Tuckman, who has been our chief economist for 3 years at the CFTC, one of the leading academics in American finance. He has the one of the most popular and important textbooks on fixed income. He left for a 3-year stint his faculty position at the New York Stern School of Business to be with us, to share his insights. He's an MIT-trained economist, and he's really continued to build out our Office of Chief Economist. So Bruce is moving on now to go back to teach future leaders of American business in the MBA and probably the doctoral program as well. But we certainly wish him well. To the points made by Commissioner Berkovitz and Commissioner Stump and others about how hardworking the commission is, I think, during this important, difficult period, a lot of Americans are facing, prospects of unemployment and things of that nature. I think they can look to us at the CFTC that not only are we working, but we're working very hard. We continue to put at the forefront our mission of promoting the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of our derivatives markets. And in many ways, not only has the work continued, but in many ways it's increased because it's so important. And the agency's role in the American economy is arguably now more important than ever. So I want to thank all of my colleagues for all of their help in the past few weeks and wish everyone a happy, restful, safe, and healthy July 4th holiday. So with that, if there's no further business, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn our meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Great. Those in favor of adjourning the meeting will say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and once again, I'm grateful to everyone, my fellow colleagues, as well as the CFTC staff for their outstanding work, and for members of the public tuning in to watch our open and transparent deliberations. The meeting is hereby adjourned.